Board here. Okay. Hi, I hope you guys are ready for a very, very intense combination of lecture. And maybe it's up to you if you decide you care to comment on the administration decision not to hold in person classes in the fall. That's gotten a lot of response, most of it, disagreeing, as I do with that decision. And the reason I bring it up, besides, obviously, it affects everybody who wanted to or was even thinking about the possibility of taking an in person class in the fall at the JC, as well as instructors who have to teach those classes. But it's also important because there are so many other colleges, as some of you know. Sonoma State, for instance, is going to have over half their classes in person and the rest online in the fall. They've already started planning for that. Says San Francisco State. Anyway, any comments you guys care to make? I can promise you that I'm not going to quote anybody, but I do have a piece coming out. Um, yeah, because to me, art classes, and you know, Louise, from being in my class, in person, you can ask more direct, even if we all had to wear a mask. Okay, so and be six, not six, 3 feet is what the CDC requirements are now, 3 feet apart. We could use a space like Annalee Hall and still have 30 students in the room, and that's a reasonable size class. A lot of the art history classes aren't that big, at their maximum at the start of the semester. I just think it's premature for them to do it this early, more than 4 months before fall semester, and not do more investigating of ways. And there are ways to balance. Here, let me let these people in here. Anyway, I'm writing now an article, hi, uh, which I will submit on tomorrow, actually, probably, or Thursday, to the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. And if I do, you guys can get extra credit, like some of you did before, for sending me, a link with, at least some evidence that you read it. It wouldn't be more than 600 or 700 words, just giving some logical reasons why there could be a path to partial reopening, or staggered, or there are different ways of putting that, or alternating between, hybrid, right? But did not have any in-person classes except for very small studio classes, no lecture classes at all, is, I don't think, the right decision. If anyone cares to comment, or how about anybody who knows someone or you yourself maybe taking classes in the fall, who know whether the other colleges, other JCs, or university college campuses, sorry, university, I mean state university campuses, or any other, public. Of course, you have to compare public schools to public schools, right? Because the funding and the requirements are roughly in line with each other in terms of, enrollment and funding and all that. So if anyone knows of any colleges or universities anywhere in Northern California, or even just the whole state of California, that are planning to have in-person classes in the fall, like I said, Sonoma State, that was in your school paper today. The article that came out in the Oak Leaf, you could take a look at it, and it quotes like about 2 dozen faculty and students. And almost every single comment was they don't agree with this decision and would rather have at least the option of, say, some, maybe half of all the classes in the fall being offered in person, the other half online. Anybody have any information about other college campuses or any comments at all?
My sister goes to Boise State and she had like hybrid classes since the beginning of this whole year, but like she's been able to go in person the whole time.
Oh, when you say hybrid, that can mean different things to different people. So, being as it's your own family, can you briefly tell us how that works? In just a minute or so,
Yeah.
or
So she had like a choice, I believe, to take in person classes or have them on Zoom. And for the majority, she chose in person just because I feel like for a lot of people, it's easier to learn that way.
yeah.
Um, but at Boise State, it was you had a choice, or it was like depending on what teacher you had, or professor, like you were
Hmm.
either on Zoom or you could go in person to the classes, but like they still had masks on and they had like their social distancing, but they were still like in person.
So maybe the classroom capacities had to be reduced, whatever, 50% or whatever the local county health people think is safe. CDC guidelines are saying 50% is safe for any indoor activity. Well, of course, if you talk about bars or something, it's a little different than a classroom where people are loud and noisy and not wearing masks hardly at all ever inside a bar, or even many larger restaurants where, if the tables are, but I've been to both indoor and outdoor dining since the recent vaccination, right, program began. By the way, my daughter just got her first vaccine today. She was so excited. She just turned 18 here in Berkeley with Pfizer. No, not Pfizer. Sorry, Moderna. So she's expecting some side effects. But unless everyone in authority is lying to us, every single health expert from Dr. Fauci on through the Walensky, is that her name, that does daily announcements and updates, and local health officials, state and county, are all telling us lies. By June 15th, anyone over 16 who wants to get a vaccination will have had ample opportunity. Oh, I'm sorry, Luis, what was that? I didn't see your, I was just about to look at your comment because anyway, if you care to say it verbally, or if not, then I guess you can, of course, do it the other way. But I don't usually take the time out to separate until the break, maybe the chat comments. Anyway, anybody else know of any other? How about any California? Sonoma State, I assume that the editor, well, I know her pretty well, Ann Belden. She's been around for years. And I've known their managing and student editors who have been students of mine over the years, over that time, 4 years now at least. And they're well respected as a campus newspaper. Personally, I think they're better than the Daily Cow, which I occasionally would submit things to when I was in graduate school at UC Berkeley. They have high standards for verifying things. Anyway, the point is, at the end of that article, it clearly states Sonoma State administrators have committed to between 45 and 55%, because they're still working on the final numbers, of course, but it's 4 months from now, for fall semester to be in-person classes, including lecture classes. Now, hybrid to me, to sort of riff off that last comment we just heard, could be 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off, so that would allow freeing up the space in those classrooms because of the limited capacity, perhaps, or the limited number of courses that could be offered online. And I'm not, as you've noticed, I'm not super high-tech oriented, but I managed to get competent, basic level competence in this technology that most people are using for online at the JC. Not everyone, but something like this, if not Zoom, something similar. And so it wouldn't be an imposition, and it would give students 50% of their time in person with the teacher and with the other students that they might want to communicate with and learn that way. And I guess as Luis, you said, yeah, for art, I know you can see slides. Well, obviously we're doing it that way on a screen, but it's not the same as having a room where you have, a projected image and a chance to interact and ask more questions. And then the teacher can stay afterwards and, obviously keep more than 3 feet away with your mask on and use hand sanitizer. We got through the swine flu. Does anybody remember that? I don't know if any of you were in college classes that far back. But I've been teaching over 25 years. Uh-oh, hang on. Just a second. It said internet unstable. Okay. When was that? It was 2009 when Obama was president. Nothing to do with him. But the point is that the CDC was very specific about, guidelines. There more people died from that in the short time it was around. Not total, because we've had now obviously COVID for well over a year. But the swine flu was a really bad flu season epidemic. It wasn't called a pandemic. Actually it was. Now I think about it, it was. Yeah, by the WHO, right? Not the rock group. Not that WHO. World Health Organization, of course. And they did declare it a pandemic at some point. But it killed tens of thousands of people. And that's not a small number, not just 10 or 20. It was in the high tens of thousands nationwide over a shorter period of 3 months, maybe 4, possibly 5, as opposed to 15 months now or 14 that we've been dealing with COVID. So it was pretty serious, and we managed to keep teaching. We just had to. We didn't actually have to wear masks. It was encouraged, but it wasn't required. Hand sanitation was, and of course, cleaning the classrooms after each lecture. Well, that's part of what is it? How many billions of dollars have the COVID relief bill out of Washington, and now 2 billion? I know that's the right amount from, I just checked it, from California state budget also that Newsom set aside for the very specific purpose of returning to teaching in person as soon as possible. If not before the end of spring, then by fall, from K through college, from kindergarten on up. And how many districts are doing it? Just today, San Francisco returned all of their preschool, kindergarten, and first through second grade. They're taking their time, they're phasing it in. Of course, at this point, that makes sense. But if, and that's not a huge if, but if we can confirm by late spring or early summer, meaning June, the first half of June, that's more than 2 months before classes start in the fall, that the vaccination supply is sufficient for anyone who wants to get a vaccination to do so. Yes, I think we should require both faculty and student who want to take in-person classes at the JC to verify they've had both shots or one, whatever, fully vaccinated. And that's done. I know it's done. I've got mine laminated. There's a card that's a physical proof, and then there's also the online thing that the people who give you the shot enter at the time they give each shot. One of my readers is doing that now for hundreds of people a week. She and her coworkers up at the VA clinics in Sonoma County in your area. And she's saying that at the rate we're going, we're going to have vaccinated everybody, because of course vets don't have to be my age. They're not all from the Vietnam era, right? Some of them just returned from overseas. So of all ages, they will have vaccinated almost everybody that wants one by late May. So I just think it's a wrong decision. I may get in trouble when the president, Dr. Chong, has read my other pieces, so he tells me in the Santa Rosa, I guess he subscribes to the Press Democrat. But I didn't make it personal. It's not about that. I know he feels he's doing the right thing, and who knows? I mean, obviously there's more than one way to look at this. But from the perspective of most of the students I've had in 2 semesters now in a row, and those of you who have commented by, email or otherwise, at least, I think most, at least allowing those of us who want to return to teaching and some options, like, either a hybrid system or every third class. I get 3 classes. That's what we all of us adjuncts are assigned. And we'll get to the lecture in just less than a minute. Now, that would mean, let's say only one of my 3 classes could be in person, but at least it would allow that portion of the student body who wants to take the class then. And if not, they could be, obviously a waiting list. Some people would drop, or the very next semester. So I hope by spring of 2022, we're fully back in person. We certainly should be. But I don't know. It doesn't seem like there's much of a will to do that. And I know that's terrible. The administration likes to hear, doesn't like to hear that some of their own staff are saying they think they made the wrong choice, but I just feel strongly about that. So anyway, if anyone cares to add comments at any point, not during the lecture or the slide portion, but if you think of something during the break or at the end of the evening, none of that's going to be, I've done the article. I'm not quoting anybody except the press release or whatever you call it, the announcement by Dr. Chong. I assume you all saw it. He sent it out last Thursday night, so most people saw it Friday. So the piece I plan to submit if and when I know the running date and have a link, I will let you guys all know, and that'd probably be next week. Although it's a done decision from what I understand. Okay, anybody have any questions about your papers, extra credit, or anything I just said relating to anything about classes? Yes, William.
Oh, no, I was just turning on my camera.
Oh, okay, no, I see. You're just adjusting. Yeah, I know I have to do that too. Otherwise, I look like I'm a floating head. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to any last call now. Anybody else have any? So you can save comments, of course, or think of them later, either for right at the end of the break or the end of the class. I will stick around. I'm going to go ahead and tell you the odds are slim that we'll finish early tonight. But this is some of the most powerful art you'll ever see. And if you don't know some of these works of art, you should have heard of at least a few of them. I would think that by the end of this evening, you'll see why they are iconic images. For instance, the very last slide, so don't leave early, is one that's very highly possible to be on the final essay section, and that's called the slave ship. It's one of the most powerful images of any period of art as a painting. And it has a very storied history. And it did help to bring about the end of slavery in the British Isles. I'll explain that. A work of art, a painting, helped influence a debate of a national parliament, the British Parliament. That doesn't happen that often, but actually with the slides you see tonight, several of them had that kind of impact. Okay, and as long before the multi-million-dollar, auction figures were out there. So these pieces are mostly in museums where you can go see them, or on the online version of those museums. Okay, so here we go. We're going to start with the first must know, which of course I need to hide here, the thumbnail. Let's get a full image. Okay. All right, so this is our first must know, but oh yeah, right, let me let this person in. Welcome, we just starting, so you didn't miss any of the lecture. All right, this is the first must know, and I'm going to give you the definitions of Romantic and Neoclassic as we get to them. So we're starting with one which really is neither. It just before the era of Romanticism and Neoclassicism, which are parallel movements that were around at the same time in Europe. We'll define those. You see those two terms you should already have noticed are on your handouts for terms to know. And for tonight, there's three of them. So when we get to them, the first example of a Romantic style slide, I'll give you that definition. But this is a little bit earlier than that. It's Hogarth, the artist's name. Last name is Hogarth. And the title is pretty straightforward. It should be easy to spell. The Marriage Contract. That's the title. The Marriage Contract, 1745. Okay, let's start out with who was Hogarth. That's really an important part of the meaning. He was the first mass-produced artist in, you just have to say British history, because it's hard to prove in all of Europe that he was the first European artist. He's the first one, in other words, the first documented or known, you could write it that way, British artist to have his works reproduced during his lifetime in large enough quantities to be seen by a large percentage of the British population. He was very popular. Now, how did he do that far back, right? No internet, right? Things were more expensive, prints and things. Okay, so here's how he did that. He would paint first, like this is a painting, it should be obvious, a scene that he wanted to convey some social criticism. So he is often considered one of the first political cartoonists because he criticized or satirized, probably a better word is satirized, right? To make a satire out of, right? To criticize with satire. So he satirized any of the social evils or ills, you can use either word, that he saw in British society. He was from London, right? So when he did the painting, then he would do at the same time, or just after that, an engraving of it. And those could be mass produced at an affordable price, like under $1 or whatever British pound would have been, of course. Enough that not poor people, but middle class people could afford to buy a copy of them. But even if they couldn't, they could see it for next to nothing, for pennies, literally pennies, in newspapers that would run a series of his drawings. And that's how he got everyone hooked on his series. It would be 12 months, one each month, one scene from 12 different episodes in the same story with a dramatic, kind of cliffhanger. You know what I'm saying? He was a great marketer. You could say he's one of the first mass marketing experts or a successful mass marketed. That's it. One of the first successful mass marketed artists in history, period, but definitely the first one in Britain. Great Britain, of course, which includes England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Okay, so he had literally hundreds of thousands of people every month looking at the engravings, which were done by him from his original paintings. So hopefully that's all clear. So that's what this is. This is a painting which then was reproduced as an engraving by him as the first in a series about marriage. Now, where's the social evil in that? Oh, yeah. What he's saying, if you look closely, we'll explain what each of these characters is doing, is the other part of the meeting. What he's saying is arranged marriages lead to grief and social problems. And indeed, in this case, what he's doing is satirizing an upper class couple right here. Look at them. They can't even stand to look at each other. That's the rather caddish, the word to be a cad, that's an old term, but, not very loyal at all to anything but himself. He's a rich, upper class, I should say upper class son. And his father is this guy here who has a lot of family history. He's even proving it. Look what he's pointing to. He's pointing to the family tree, which is oddly growing out of the stomach of a knight from the Middle Ages in his, obviously, his original family origins, whatever they were. So he's just, in other words, he's saying, I have a title, right, to sell. That's what's happening here. These two men, the father of the landed gentry, they called me, just say nobleman, just keep it simple. This father, who is a nobleman, right, has a title, but he's cash poor. So he wants cash, and guess how he's going to get it? Marrying his son off to this poor, unhappy woman who is the daughter of the rich merchant. The merchant wants a title. So he's going to get a title by marrying into you. You get what's going on here. It's more than just an arranged marriage. It's a cold-hearted business deal between two selfish men who couldn't care less about the happiness of their own children. That's the point that's being made here. And then you'll see, if you follow this, you can go online, I think, because it's in all the major British, in several of the, I should say several British museums. And even, I think it's the one in Honolulu. I can't remember. There's another one somewhere in the US that has the entire collection of this series. Hogarth did dozens and dozens of these. He'd do at least one a year, sometimes more, because he was a quick artist. He could do these paintings quickly and do the engravings. So he could rapidly turn out a series of these. So he did more than one a year or one a month, right? Every month he'd do a new installment in that series, but he'd do multiple series at any given time. The man was amazingly productive and a brilliant marketer. But he was trying to do it not just to become famous and wealthy, yes, he did become both, but to make a statement about problems in British society. So with this one, he's saying, look what's going to happen to this couple, because to finish up the notes on the meeting now, what he showed with his later illustrations in this series, which, if you care to know, is called marriage à la mode, the French word, right? Marriage à la mode means the fashion to marry off, a rich daughter to a wealthy, self-centered, egotistical son of a nobleman, because that gives the two parents, the fathers, the mothers, you notice, aren't involved in this decision. The fathers are deciding the future of their children without their children's consent. That's what he's saying is wrong. And what it'll lead to? Oh, everything from infidelity, of course, cheating, to STDs. Oh, yes, there was a lot of that back then, even though they had condoms that far back. Raging cases throughout London of all kinds of STDs that were around then. And alcoholism, drug addiction, physical and emotional abuse, and eventually destructive behavior, where I think it's the woman has to leave because her husband becomes so abusive, and she becomes homeless and has to turn to prostitution to support herself and her child, who's now out on the street. It's just one disaster after another. And by the end, you can see the point he's making, but well before the end, that this isn't a healthy thing to do, to force people to get married because the fathers of the two families just want something for their own gain, for their own benefit, without considering the health and well-being of their own children. Okay, so that's the meaning here. Formal analysis, it's brilliantly balanced. I would say unbalanced toward the bottom if you don't count the paintings as masses, but they are, aren't they? I mean, if that's the case, it's balanced both ways. But clearly this guy's in the middle. Oh, these are lawyers here, by the way, if it's not obvious. These two guys drawing up the contract, the marriage contract. And then we have obviously rhythm of the the wigs on the two pair and the two lawyers, right? And then we have, of course, their arms, legs, heads, and the paintings on the wall. There's so much rhythm everywhere. Here you have, for space, you have scientific perspective. It's in the distance. There'd be a vanishing point beyond the wall. But you also have, I call this atmospheric perspective, right? It's slightly hazier and a little hint of bluish gray color on the buildings about 2 blocks away, you know, across the street. In the distance, they're not just a block away. They're probably, you know, half a, whatever, 2 or 3 blocks away. And they have a slight hazy look. So there's some atmospheric perspective just in the window. There's definitely a scientific perspective, a vanishing point. There's overlapping, foreshortening, and diminishing size. By now, you guys have done this on your first paper, so I hope you all are clear on how to do those, all the elements that you see in your second paper. Okay, wait for the internet to become stable again. Okay, hopefully everything is back to normal. It just left. It shows me usually when that happens. It just lasts a few seconds. All right, so let's finish the formal elements. Everything is thin outline. There's no bold outline here. The largest mass, well, that you decide. Is it the people, if they're one mass, or just this group? Is it the largest painting? Is it the wall? You decide. Or even this kind of tent here that they don't explain what that's about. Maybe it does in the newspapers. By the way, the newspapers ran a running commentary. I think that was written by, I'm not sure, just say along with each of the illustrations, engravings, right? Each month was a segment of the story. So you see how, you know, a serial type approach, you know, like soap operas and other things do now. It was brilliant. Yeah, so there'd be an explanation of all the details for readers who couldn't tell by just looking. Anyway, so what you have then is stable or dynamic, mostly stable. Look at the two their fathers are sitting pretty well upright. So is the foppish is the word they'd use that with an F, or cad of a son. And then she and that lawyer for her father about the only two that are dynamic, because the upper bodies, but even them, their lower bodies are not, or hers at least, are fairly stable. The wall with the paintings is both. Obviously, it angles out to a corner, that makes that dynamic, but each painting is stable. Okay, the modeling is realistic and sharp everywhere on the figures of the people and all the objects, as this is the same with the similar texture on their hair, their skin, their clothing. The colors are, of course, warm on the two, which is ironic, but the cold symbolizes the coldness of lack of emotional connection between the bride and husband to be here, obviously. The wall has green wallpaper, I guess it is, so that's obviously cool, but the paintings are mostly warm with the gold frames. Okay, let's move on to the next must-know. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, these are Stocksted's files of slides, because almost every, well, let's say 3/4 of the ones that are on the syllabus are in Stockstead. So rather than reinvent the wheel, I'm using hers. And the order they're appearing in is not necessarily going to follow exactly the order I put them in the syllabus, which I rearrange anyway. So we will get to all the ones on the syllabus that we're covering tonight. And I also promise you to cut at least one of those to reduce the amount of time that we'll have to take, and maybe end slightly early. Okay. All right. So we're going forward to, let's see. I think we're going to skip one of these here. Yeah, I had this one on my R2.3 syllabus that I just created right before they shut the college down. So that's not on this one now. So we're going to skip over this. That's a really interesting one. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Mara. There's a quick, it's not a must know. It's not even on the syllabus. The Sleep of Reason, this is called, and it's about nightmares and how sometimes evil spirits can enter your mind, soul, or body and even take it over while you're sleeping. There's even a movie about that with Olga Kurylenko from Russia as a leading figure in that, and based on some legends and cultures all around the world that believe in those things. So that's an illustration from that one. Okay, so here we go. This is the next must know now. Okay, so it's down the list of ways. Like I said just a moment ago, the order isn't what's important. It's that they're all part of this lecture tonight from the list that's in your syllabus. Okay, so going down to, I think it's number 6, Blake, Newton, Measuring the Universe. Blake, of course, is the artist's last name, Blake. Newton, yes, that is the scientist's name, Newton, Newton, Measuring the Universe. Okay, 1795. Boy, this one is also a powerful image. And if you haven't heard of Blake, that's how I'm going to start with most of these, the meaning, which I've been doing anyway, when it comes to paintings anyway, is to talk about the role that artist, that painter in this case, had at that time and why they're, someone that's still respected and known now, centuries later. Who was Blake? First of all, his name was William Blake. You don't have to know his first name, but it was William Blake because there's a lot of other Blakes in the history of art, right, and science. He was a quasi, some would say, New Age spiritualist. That's not a minor point. He was first and foremost an artist, but he also wrote essays, whole books on everything from history to religion to philosophy. He was a multi-talented man. In other words, he was what today we often call Renaissance man, but that might confuse some of you. He wasn't in the Renaissance. It ended hundreds of years before he was born. So he was writing in the late 17th, early 1800s, late 18th and early 19th century, at a time when science was beginning to be accepted by a majority of educated people. This is before Darwin now, but physics, Newton invented physics, right? I think most of you know that. If you didn't, you should write, who was Newton, the subject of this painting by Blake? He was the father, that's how most people call him, the father, or you would say the inventor of physics, the modern science of physics on which all other modern sciences are based. And that's not me saying, that's Einstein said that. Without Newton, none of the rest of us would have discovered the things we have discovered. So he's sometimes called the father of modern science, that broad a title, but certainly the father of physics and the concept of physics. So obviously he was a genius, he was a brilliant person. And he discovered all these laws of how, energy and things work in the universe that we still know are true today, right? 300 years later. Newton existed a century before Blake, by the way. He wasn't contemporary with Blake. So by the time Blake comes along, Newton's teachings were, of course, well known and accepted by almost all educated people. But there was another aspect to this topic and to the life of Newton, and that Newton was somewhere in, I guess you would say, agnostic category. He didn't know for sure. There were times during his life, he lived to be almost 80 or so years old. So during his long life, Newton, the scientist now, would sometimes say he believed in God, other times say not, and sometimes say he just didn't know. So Blake, however, was not, I don't want to say he was devoutly religious, but I just said he was a spiritualist. He didn't think any one religion had all the answers. That was very liberal, but not uncommon during his period of time. There was beginning to be questions about, whether any one philosophy, religion, country, system, whatever, including the French Revolution, was an example of that kind of intense questioning of the existing systems in France, right? There were some challenges then to the accepted, mainstream ideas, including with Blake. Blake was saying, well, maybe we shouldn't blindly believe everything in the Bible literally, even though he called himself nominally a Christian. But he also believed in a New Age spiritualism, that there were other religious beliefs or even non-religious beliefs that could explain things. So I just want to make sure you know that before I launch into why is he painting Newton as a young man whom I doubt ever looked like this. Look at his six-pack here, right? Buff, right? Guy sitting at, where is he sitting? Can anybody tell? He's not sitting in a normal place where sunlight comes. Say again? Go ahead.
Is he underwater?
Yeah, you got it. Perfect. Yes. He's at the bottom of the ocean. And so what's the message here? Well, okay, Newton, everyone, including Blake, accepted the fact he was brilliant. and he created all kinds of new information for science to follow. However, his doubts about a higher power are what's being satirized here by Blake. Blake did believe that whatever else you want to think about religion, established religion notwithstanding, he wasn't, like I said, he wasn't trying to promote any one established religion, but the concept of there being a higher power, he felt, Blake, was very clear to him, of course, and other people like him. So what he was saying here we go. Here's the bottom line of the meaning of this work of art. It's satirizing Newton by saying, you could be the smartest man alive. And during his lifetime, maybe he was. Just say, one of the smartest men that ever lived, or people that ever lived, right? You could be brilliant, you could be a genius, however you want to word that, and still miss the big picture, which is that the forces of nature, which according to Blake are some evidence for the fact that he believed, prove that there is a higher power, call it what you want, God, or the force, any way you want to word that, but of course God would be the word they would have used then. So that there is either a higher power or God is verified by the fact there are things we cannot explain in this universe and on this earth. And if you ignore the forces of nature, you do so at your own peril. In other words, I'll summarize it another way that you could just say in a single sentence. If this was on the essay part of the final, as far as meaning of it goes, here Blake is saying that Newton may have been a genius, but he wasn't paying attention wasn't recognizing the fact that all around you are things you cannot measure. See, he's measuring, right? The universe, of course, the title tells us that. In other words, higher powers or the existence of a God or a higher power can't be measured. And you can't look at it that way. And if you do, you're missing the big picture. You're missing the universe and the forces of nature that are all around us, which Blake felt proves that there is some kind of higher power. And that's why he's being somewhat not ridiculing Newton, but in a way he is. He's satirizing him. So it's kind of a way of expressing the fact that science doesn't have all the answers. Is another way. More and more, right? Maybe each generation, certainly with Newton, they took a leap forward in helping to explain the phenomena of the physical universe, but it doesn't explain things that can't be measured, like spiritual things and forces of nature, and the universe, the other planets, the stars. By then people were well aware there were trillions of stars out there, or at least billions anyway, and that there must be life on other planets, whatever else they thought about traveling to those planets 200 years ago. They knew that there was a chance there were other forms of life, not just human beings and the other, animals and plants on our planet. So in other words, it's a broader way of looking at existence, that there are some things you can measure. Great. Newton figured all those things out in some way, or not all, but the main principles behind measuring physical universe and the actions of objects on each other. But that doesn't explain everything there is. And he's not aware of that, or he's ignoring it to his peril. I mean, obviously, a real person was down at the bottom of the ocean, they die either from the pressure, the water pressure, or from drowning. But Newton is oblivious to it. Okay, so here we go. Formal analysis. Yes, here's our first definition. My apologies. I mean, I wasn't going to forget, but it's Romanticism. There are three main features you see on your list of terms to know. Three main features of Romantic art, and they can be briefly stated. Okay, the three main features of Romantic art. You might be asked to verify this or true, false. Remember that's the section that was on the midterm. There'll be another similar one relating to the definitions where you don't have to recount them verbatim, but know if the statement about one of the definitions is true or false. So here we go. The three main features of Baroque art. Number one, bold, vivid, and unrealistic colors. Oh, you see that here. When you look at the rock here and the colors on it here, and even his hair, and maybe even the surface of the bottom of the ocean. In any case, there are some bold and vivid colors here, considering that if you were to look down at the bottom of the ocean, you wouldn't see these colors. Certainly not with the naked eye. So bold, number one feature, bold, vivid, and unrealistic colors. Okay. Number two is a dynamic and imaginative composition. Well, obviously, this is, I don't think Newton ever thought about going to the bottom of the ocean. And of course, he may be stable on his backside with his legs and, his hip there. But the rest of his body and the rock he's sitting on, that's obviously all dynamic. So, dynamic and imaginative compositions. That's a second feature. Okay. And the third is a strong emotional component. And that's obviously true here, where you have two kind of competing emotions. You have the intellectual concentration, intense concentration of the scientist on his work. And then you have the danger. It's almost like you can see someone carrying a sign or a fish swimming by, maybe a shark with a sign in its jaw, danger, get out. I mean, obviously there's an intense sense of danger involved in this picture, saying, if anyone did what this figure, this image of Newton was doing in real life, they would be dead in a few minutes. So there is an intense emotional component in this in all romantic works of art. So it's a movement of art that began in Europe. It did spread beyond Europe, though. It began in Europe in the late 1700s and lasted to the late 1800s. That's not something you'll have to know, just giving you context. But everyone got the definition? Anybody need me to repeat any of those three features of romantic art? Anybody? Okay, good, because that could come up on the. All right, formal analysis, pretty straightforward. I've already said it's a mixture of stable, dynamic. Part of Newton's figure is stable, but his arms and his back are dynamic, as the entire rock outcropping, I think that's the right phrase, that he's sitting on. They're all curved lines. Okay, and then we have the rhythm of his body, obviously the feet, the hands, the muscles here, of course, even somewhat the curly hair. I have no idea if there were no photos of Newton. Obviously, he was. So I don't know if Blake ever even tried to find an image of Newton to base this on. I doubt it. Anyway, so then we have, of course, the rhythm of the formations of what are they? I guess they're coral, right, on the rock itself that he's sitting on, as well as the curl or scrolling up of this paper he's writing on. Lots of rhythm, modeling, very strong, obviously, and realistic all over, everywhere on his body, or you can say his skin, right? And even on that piece of paper and on the rock. The colors are warm on him, of course, skin tones, and even his hair, right? Those are all warm tones, cool on the piece of paper. And for some reason, he's got something next to him that he's not using to protect himself from it'd be very cold, by the way, down there, really cold. It's another easy freeze to death there. So this is what cloth or clothing, or you could say a robe that's white, off white, of course, a little bit, well, maybe just dirty or wet. Anyway, that's cool. But most of the colors are on the rock. Well, it's a mixture, really, but more warm than cool. Obviously, it's an alternating blues, reds, yellows, grays. And then the water around them is entirely, of course, in almost all of the seabed or ocean floor, as it is, are cool off the kind of a dark, deep bluish green. And then the largest mass is the rock he's sitting on, then him, then the paper he's writing on. It's balanced. Very. I like the way this is balanced. If you look carefully and you measured this, I read somewhere in one of the students' papers that wrote about this piece. It's almost identical. The area behind him, and the sea around him, and the solid objects that we see in the foreground of him and the rock, almost equally, very carefully balanced in a diagonal way. But that still qualifies, I would say. Therefore, you draw a line down the middle, either top to bottom or left to right. You got balance. And let's see, obviously some texture is very realistic on the rock, on his skin, on his hair, and his clothing. For space, you have overlapping. And I would say there's a little bit of foreshortening on the piece of paper, but that's about it. So very minimal foreshortening and overlapping. There's no other techniques for space in this. There's no vanishing point. And you wouldn't call the ocean's atmospheric perspective. It's just the color of deep blue sea. Okay, this is a really important work. By the way, And now tonight, it's going to be a little more than usual. I always try to give you guys a heads up about which slides are so important that I won't cut them from the study list. Well, that's hard to do tonight because about half of them, at least, maybe over half, are so important. This is one of them. Copley is the next must know, the third one. Now, it's a lot to say about this one. Copley, the artist name, Copley. Watson and the Shark is the title. Watson, Watson, and the Shark, 1778. Okay, let's start out with who was Copley. Well, if you've been to Boston, you can't ignore him and his importance. In the city of Boston, there are parks, a subway station, a street, and a public square named after him. So who was he? He was America's first full-time professional artist. That's a big statement, but it's pretty well documented. By which we mean what? We mean he's the first American born and raised artist. Well, he was a painter, so you could just say painter, to be able to make a living strictly from his art. But guess what? He had to leave America. He had to leave North America, which wasn't a country yet. United States, sorry, wasn't. That's why I said he had to leave North America, not the United States. It didn't exist. He left before the Revolution. Well, actually, just at the start of it. He went to England, which is where he was able to become a successful painter. But that doesn't change the fact that he was born and raised. Here we go. He was born, Copley, this artist, was born and raised in Boston. So he's the first, you could say colonial American, but you don't have to say it that way. You can just say American born and raised artist to become a full-time successful painter. But he moved to England because here in the US, he had a career, but he couldn't support his family because people didn't buy art that much in the colonial times. They were busy, doing whatever else they did. Not that many people made a living off of part-time living off of art. And he couldn't support his family, so he moved to England. So here he was living in England when an incident occurred. This is what we're looking at now. The main part of the meaning is, what event is this? Well, some of you must have seen this. It's a pretty famous image. Well, his is one of several. He did over a half a dozen. I think it was like 8. You could just say several different images of this, which are each one is slightly altered, but they all depict the same scene, which is what? An incident that occurred in Havana Harbor. Now, I doubt anyone in any of my classes yet. I've never heard of anyone who's been to Cuba. I have several times. I made friends with a family down there, and they let me stay with them in their extra rooms in their old Victorian era building in Havana. It's a beautiful country, beautiful culture. Havana Harbor doesn't look much different than this. There are no skyscrapers, maybe 2 hotels built in the 50s before we shut down all trade with Cuba, right? By American hotel companies. One is I think the Hyatt, and the other one is the Hilton, and they both belong to the government now. So there's just no high rises there. The tallest buildings, maybe 2 or 3 in the harbor are these church towers. So this shows a scene. Here we go. Here's what literally happened to summarize it it takes more than a couple sentences. It was a scene that occurred, or an incident, you could say an incident rather, that occurred in Havana Harbor, where a British merchant marine ship, it's not a naval vessel, these are not sailors, you see the British flag there, the British merchant marine ship, meaning they're civilians, paid crew, right, trading on a ship that's in Havana Harbor. So a British merchant, 2 words, marine ship crew, went rowing in Havana Harbor, and one of them, Watson, of course, that's what the painter's name is, title is named after, named Watson. One of them, named Watson, jumped in for a swim and was attacked by a shark, and one of his legs was bitten off below the knee. Can you see that there? This actually is cleaning it up. He nearly died, in other words, and he was rescued at the last moment by his shipmates. And this painting also illustrates one of, if not the first, accurate, or you could say, non-religious, actually, that's the right way to say it, accurate and non-religious image of an African. He would have been British. He would have been a British citizen. He wasn't a slave. There were slaves in the British Empire then. This is from the 1700s, obviously. So we're looking at that time when slavery was all over. the colonies of every country at that time that had colonies. But he wasn't a slave. He was a citizen of Britain, and he's the one that actually saved Watson. So that's another, it may be a not major detail, but it's not minor, that he's depicted with an honest, straightforward, you could say, image of what he actually looked like. How did the artist know? He interviewed every single one of the crew, including Watson, about that day to do the painting. He wanted to make this painting to create, yes, he did, a market for more copies. Again, you got to survive. Artists have to too. So he managed. That's why I said he did about, I think it was 8 at least, maybe 10 different images. You can just see several different versions of this, and each one sold to a different collector because this was national news. Why? Because these guys survived and came back and told their story, and they made money. Each member of the crew that you see in the painting, including the fool, excuse my French, Watson. I mean, come on. If you ever go to Havana, the sharks are 24 hours a day. You see them at night. In the daytime, you see their fins come up almost onto the. You got to be a fool to jump into a shark-infested harbor, but that's what Watson did. So the fact that he nearly died, you'd think would make him the butt of jokes, but it didn't. It made him famous. He was one of the first mainstream media figures to get attention. He toured all over with some, not all, but some of the people that saved him in the boat, telling this story for money. The audiences, hundreds of people would pay to go hear him tell what it was like to nearly be eaten by a shark. So they managed to kill the shark before it got back for a second, would have bitten his head off probably. And so this scene is imaginative. This part of the scene is imaginative. So this is a romantic painting, and it's so powerfully, obviously romantic that if that's not obvious, then the last 2 things about the meaning, one of those should be that this, remember, the style of a painting or any work of art is part of its meaning. And if this is on the, again, has a high possibility of being one of the slide essay slides on the final because it's so iconic. So what we see here, the last 2 things of the meaning are an exaggeration of all the details. For instance, Watson wasn't nude. He's shown as being nude to make him more vulnerable, to make him look innocent, never mind stupid or a fool. That we leave aside here on this painting. He's supposed to be the victim. So he's supposed to, it's all part of the meaning now, symbolize good. Okay, I don't think that's how I define good, but that's what the artist was trying to convey. And many of his audience, the people who came to hear Watson speak, saw him as the innocent, nearly, dead victim of the shark, who's supposed to symbolize, you can guess it, evil. Never mind, it's just following its instincts to survive, but nonetheless, the shark, in other words, summarizing it again, is symbolic in this painting of evil, and Watson, being nude especially, is symbolic, supposedly, of good. So the underlying message here is, in order for good men, this whole boatload of people, including, of course, Watson in the water, they're supposed to symbolize good men. In order for good men to triumph over evil, it is necessary for them to band together. Okay, well, they saved their friend's life. So obviously these guys, did something heroic, unlike their friend Watson. Anyway, and the last fact about the meaning is what are the exaggerations besides 3 things, and actually 4. The color of the water is not realistic at all. That's exaggerated to the point I've been having slides of each time I visited Havana. Of course, I went down to the harbor with different friends and took photos and things, different times of the year. Yeah, the water never gets that green. So the color of the water is a bold, vivid, exaggerated color. Well, that makes this romantic. And then we have the hazy, misty look. Well, there is almost never fog in Havana Harbor. That's another fact. But he never went to Cuba, the artist. He was just depending on 2 things. One, the interviews with the crew about the actual event. And then for the setting, he was relying on his imagination and prints. Of course, there were prints, engravings of Havana Harbor by this time that he could have looked at. So he didn't know most of the details. He had to recreate them. He got the lighthouse right. There is such a lighthouse right there at the entrance, and there are church steeples. So he got the structures of the horizon or the harbor, the background. He got that correct. But putting fog in there, especially in the summer, in a hot day, in broad daylight, no, it's not like San Francisco. there's almost never fog in the bottom. So he added the fog. He knew probably it wasn't accurate to create a dreamlike or more like a nightmare-like quality. And then the last exaggeration. And does anybody see something wrong with the shark here? Is there something unrealistic the way this shark is painted? Anybody?
Its nose, the nostrils are all
Well,
wrong.
actually, you're right. I meant to emphasize one other part of its anatomy, and if you squint, it jumps out at you like a ton of bricks, as my dad would say, at 90 miles an hour. Yeah, he's exaggerated the nostrils, and that's only on this version, by the way. But in all the versions he did this same inaccurate detail on the shark's head. What else do you notice that looks unrealistic?
I think it was just said in the chat, actually, human lips.
Yeah, okay, there you go, you guys. Sharks don't have lips. Somebody put lips on a shark. I have no idea how that entered his head. I think it's just a mistake, I think. Or of course he thought it may be. Yeah, but human lips, no one's ever put it that way before. Actually, it's pretty good. You could use that if it's on the exam. Yeah, that's definitely an inaccurate detail, as are the exaggerated color of the water and the fog in the background. So this has the emotional component of good versus evil, an intense struggle of good versus evil, if you look at it that way, right? Imminent death, being snatched from the jaws of death, however you want to write that, at the last second. And then, of course, it's imaginative. I just gave you the reasons why. Imaginative and obviously dynamic. Look at it. And then we have the strong emotional component. I'm sorry, I already said that. The colors are exaggerated, are vivid, bold, vivid, and unrealistic colors, especially on the water, but somewhat in the fog itself too, because that's obviously affects the colors. All right, that's plenty on the meaning. You wouldn't have to remember more than 6 of those facts if it's on the essay part of the final. But yeah, you do want to keep your notes on this and study them carefully. All right, formal analysis. It's roughly balanced, but I know a lot of people feel these two guys standing weights it or unbalances it toward the right. However, I think the ship and the church towers roughly balance it. And then when you go down here, there's another way to say it as balanced side to side, left to right. Because Watson's body, because you see all of it and only part of theirs, and they're further away, is roughly the same area. Covered by the two standing figures. So I think it's roughly balanced top to bottom and left to right. But if you see it differently, that's up to you. But it's certainly the shark roughly balances out Watson's body. All right, and then we have the obvious rhythm of his arms, hands, and part of I shouldn't say 1.5 legs anyway. Now he actually only lost, but he was lucky. He walked around up on stage to give his talk. Don't write this. His talks for money, of course. I don't know. I wonder how much they charged per person for a year or so after this incident when they got back to England on his wooden leg. And according to what I've read about those talks he gave, he would deliberately hit that wooden leg as hard as he could to make the loudest noise possible on the wooden stage as he walked up to the podium to talk about what happened and then answer questions. That's kind of, I don't know, hamming it up. Well, anyway, well, at least he had another, life after this. He wouldn't have if it wasn't for this guy here and this guy here with the harpoon. Okay, so is it dynamic or stable? Well, more dynamic, obviously, than stable. I used to think of it as equal, but really, when you look, even the two guys that are standing are diagonals. These guys in the boat are maybe the most stable things. Perhaps. Well, not this man here, and neither Watson or the shark, nor the boat, right, nor their own ship in the distance, or the other sharks. It's more dynamic than stable. And then there's realistic simulated texture, but soft and yet realistic modeling on especially on the water on Watson and the shark, and even on the background, as we just said, because of the fake fog or unrealistic fog. For space, this does have all the main techniques except register line, of course, overlapping, foreshortening, diminishing size, of course, as you get further back. And yes, there is a scientific perspective, and yes, there is atmospheric perspective, which would exist even without the fog, because you would see even on a clear, sharp, sunny day, buildings that far away would have a blue hazy look. So there's accurate use of all those major techniques, including atmospheric perspective. The largest mass, it's against the harbor, the water, and then the boat, And then I guess you could call this one mass. These people overlap each other. If you want to count the whole crew together as one mass. And then it's almost equal between Watson and the shark. Maybe the shark is slightly larger. Okay, and the colors, of course, are cool on the water and the shark and some of the clothes, or the shirts anyway, at least, of the men in the boat. Well, not just their shirts, some of the clothing. And others, of course, their skin tones, all of Watson's naked body, the boat, and the buildings in the background are all warm. All right, moving on.
May I
Yes,
ask just
please,
one
go
question?
ahead, go ahead. Yes.
It was all the techniques for space except for
Register. Yeah, that's only in ancient artwork. You don't see that in modern painting or drawing. Yeah, so the others, again, foreshortening, overlapping, diminishing size. I don't know if I said that. I should have diminishing size, right? And scientific and atmospheric perspective are all present on that one. Okay, this is the next must know. How are we doing on time? Let's see. Yeah, we're doing pretty well. Vigée Lebrun, that's Vigg, the artist's last name, is a hyphenated last name, Vigee, and then second word, Lebrun. This is Marie Antoinette with her children. Marie Antoinette with her children. In case you haven't seen her name, as famous as she is, I'll spell her last name, Antoinette. If you happen to have seen the more recent, why am I forgetting her name? I can't. Who starred with in the second Spider-Man movie as his girlfriend? I'm forgetting her. Kirsten Dunst got it. Did you see that? Anybody version of Marie Antoinette's life? Not very accurate, except for the fact that she was kind of innocent in the beginning. Okay, so let's talk about who this is. And first, who was Vigée Lebrun? That isn't going to take that long because you could summarize the main reason that she is still remembered today is she was one of, right, the painter, one of the first and one of the few successful female painters in Europe at that time. There had been some as early as 200 years earlier. And we talked about them, remember, for the 1600s, about as far back as you could find in Europe, a woman who could make a career from painting. But there was even fewer then. You'd think 200 years later, there's some progress. Not really. There were still only a handful of women painters in Europe who were full-time professional artists, and she was one. But what made her so successful was she painted the upper classes, and the wealthy and the ruling classes. She painted their portraits, both singly and in groups. And of course, she would get, if she was good at it, and she was good at it, a lot of commissions. So this was a commission by the Queen of France. I think everybody knows, right, who Marie Antoinette was, but boy, if you don't, you do want to add this to your notes. She's the one that lost her head along with her husband and one of her children, I think her oldest child, during the French Revolution. They were executed, beheaded, right? But this is long before the French Revolution. This is when she had, as you can see here, I think, 3 children. I believe she eventually had 4. But anyway, let's just say at this point she had 3 children, and she wanted to be shown as a really good mother. And that's what this painting, of course, conveys. But there's another side to her, and we'll keep it brief because I want to pick up the pace. So by the end of the break, or at start of the break, I mean, we have covered half roughly of the slides we need to see tonight. But just to add to that, you may not know this, she was only 15 when she was married, an arranged marriage, again, to a much older king, the King of France, of course. She wasn't from France, she was from Austria. And so, of course, at that point in her life, she was an innocent pawn, right? You could empathize with that. I certainly would. But later on, when she was well into her 30s and she had her own secret police spying on her own people, she knew the starvation and suffering of the French population, not just the peasants, but even much of the middle class were barely being able to feed their families. While the rich ruling class, at this point, you know the history of the French Revolution, I hope, or at least you have some idea, right, that it was really inevitable. It was inevitable. I mean, that much abuse by a sliver of not even 1%, a tiny segment of the population, completely keeping all the wealth and power for themselves with no reform, none, zero, no attempt to reform. She is the one who said, let them eat cake. Some people say she didn't really say it. So she said something else like, let them eat bread. Well, either way, that would be beyond insensitive because she knew she had to. She was a well-educated woman. And by her 30s, she knew for 20 years of living in France how much the average citizen of France was suffering under the rule of her husband. And she had no empathy for them. I mean, you could say what you want about the rest of her, story of her life, but in the end, I think, and sadly, she may have brought on, she and her husband both, of course, brought on the French Revolution sooner than it would have otherwise happened by their insensitivity to the suffering of their own people. So that's not indicated here because the artist isn't thinking like that. The artist is a friend of the well-to-do and, of course, therefore portrays them in a positive light. For instance, as a good mother here, doting and loving. And actually, there is, to be fair, there is no evidence that she was anything but a good mother. And not all royal family members are. We know that, don't we? After the last few years since Diana's time. Yeah, I mean, every royal family has dysfunctional members. And after the break, you'll see a portrait of the Spanish royal family that ought to make you cringe about how dysfunctional they were around the same time. But at this point, the painting is just trying to convey her as an ideal mother and a loving, parent. Okay. And it's romantic, boy, is it? First of all, there's a gauzy, hazy look. You see that even over her face and over her children. Then the background is kind of indistinct, isn't it? And then the whole thing has an overall reddish cast, which wouldn't be, the actually in the original painting, it's even the wallpaper, but certainly the furniture here is red, not just her dress and her daughter's dress, but the rug. There's in red is a color of passion, right? And various other aspects of human emotion. So there's an emotional component, a deep mother's love for her children, okay, is the overall intent or meaning or purpose, I should say, of the painting. And then we have the imaginative scene. Well, yeah, of course it is. I mean, her kids were, I don't know how they all would have stayed stable or still, I should say, long enough to be painted like this. So, of course, it's a recreation of reality, therefore imaginative. And it is not as dynamic. That's the only slight difference between this romantic painting and most others. But then you also do have the bold and exaggerated colors, the red overtones of almost everything in the painting. Again, this is a slightly different tone than the actual painting. Here, the wallpaper in the original painting is somewhat of a red hue, as well as the rest of the background and most of the figures' clothing and even their faces, right, to a large degree. Okay, so that's it on the meaning of this one. It's balanced, roughly, but some people make the case that this is taller than the top of her feathered hat. This, whatever it is, piece of furniture, I guess, a cabinet. Maybe. I see it as roughly balanced, but then it is definitely unbalanced toward the bottom. And she's the largest mass, that should be obvious. And then it would be her daughter, and then her older son, and then the baby. For space, you have overlapping, foreshortening, and diminishing size. Those are really the only, the rug has diminishing detail on it. And of course, there's foreshortening on the furniture, including the crib, and obviously overlapping. There is soft but realistic modeling. That's true of most romantic paintings. But also we have this strong and realistic textures on the hair and the clothing and the skin. And it has thin outline around them, all of the objects. And I'd say it's mostly stable. So the only thing here, it's slightly less dynamic, like I said, but there's some dynamic detail. There we go. Okay. Welcome. We are just getting to the third must know. Here is it, or is it the fourth? Marie Antoinette and her children, or with her children. So welcome. Anyway, we're about to finish up the formal analysis on this. The colors are warm mostly because of the reddish hue of so much of the background, right? As I was saying earlier, from the rug all the way up to this piece of furniture and their clothing. And the skin tones, of course, are warm, but there are a little bit of cool colors here, I guess, on the crib mostly, and on her white feathers. Those are probably very expensive, rare bird feathers, I'm assuming, from one of their French colonies or something, probably. She's the one that built, don't write this. She built a fake peasants' village and pretended to be a milkmaid living among the peasants to entertain herself while they were starving just a few miles outside the palace grounds at Versailles. If you go to Versailles, you can see it. It should give you kind of a little bit of context if you didn't know, much about this period of history. Okay, I think we've covered most of these dynamics, mostly stable. Yeah, I think modeling. Yeah, I already mentioned that. I believe we covered everything. Yeah. Oh, the rhythm is obvious. I guess I forgot that. With it, obviously the arms and heads and clothing. All right, now we're going to get to an artist who's so important that one of the two I will not cut from the study list. One of the two, there are two you see by David. This one is David, or some people think his last name sounds like the first name David, but that's not in French. It's David, D-A-V-I-D, the artist. Death of Marat. That's just like it sounds for the first word in Marat, the person whose dead body we're looking at is M-A-R-A-T, 1793. Okay, so we'll start with who David was. He was the most famous, and you could say successful if you want to add that, most famous and successful of all French neoclassic painters. So now it's time for the second definition for tonight, which isn't very long. Neoclassicism was a style of, and we're focusing only on painting. No, actually, that's broadened because some of the architecture slides are neoclassic. So again, I'll start over. Sorry, neoclassicism was a movement of art in Europe from the late 1700s to the late 1800s. From the late 1700s to the late 1800s, comma, which was a revival of ancient classical art, more accurate and authentic than past revivals. I'll say the whole thing again. There's a movement of art in Europe from the late 17 to the late 1800s, comma, which was a revival of ancient classical art, comma, more authentic and accurate than past revivals. That means the artists actually studied the past antique arts, or ancient, I should say, ancient arts that they were imitating or inspired by. Before that, some of you wouldn't remember, but Rembrandt was painting scenes from the Bible with Roman soldiers, and the soldiers were dressed in 17th century Dutch armor. The Romans didn't wear full suits of armor, and go into battle like that, right? They had breastplates, and if you've seen any TV series on ancient Rome. Okay, so the point is that this is a more accurate and authentic revival than past revivals, because by now there was historians and archaeologists, and they were discovering Pompeii was already known by this time. The ruins of it had been discovered. So this is a period when there's a lot of inspiration from the ancient classical world in all the arts, everything from architecture to painting to poetry even, and drawing, So in painting, this is a neoclassic painting. And how so? Where's the ancient connection? Well, just give me a moment to make the case that this is a good example of a neoclassic painting by the most famous neoclassic French painter of all time. He was so famous that Napoleon hired him to be the court painter for him and his wife, his Empress Josephine, a few years later. So what are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at the murdered corpse. Well, corpse is dead, but not necessarily murdered, so I'm not being redundant. The murdered corpse of one of the leaders of the French Reign of Terror. And if you don't know what that is, it wouldn't make sense if you didn't. The Reign of Terror, I think most people have heard of it, was the period of the French Revolution when hundreds of thousands, the estimates are 250,000, some people lower, but realistic, it was that, around that. To say when hundreds of thousands of innocent French citizens were executed without trial, merely on suspicion of being, quote, enemies of the revolution, unquote. So he was one of the three leaders of the Reign of Terror, and that's R-E-I-G-N, not R-A-I-N. Doesn't matter how you spell it if you write it in the text. If this is on the slide essay part of the final, the spelling of any word not on the syllabus isn't going to cost 2 points. But if you want to get the spelling right, like to rule over. So he was one of three people who ruled over France. They were dictators. They were like a triumvirate. You know, the Romans used to do that. Sometimes they'd have three emperors rule together. So this was a period of dictatorship, mass terror, mass executions of innocent people. Like, for instance, if you didn't like your neighbor and you had an argument with them, you could just go to the local official in your neighborhood, wherever you lived in France, and say, he's an enemy of the revolution, and they'd take him away at night and he'd be dead within a few days. Or if you wanted your neighbor's property, or you coveted your neighbor's wife or husband, because men and women both could testify against anyone. It was a horrible period. It lasted like 2 years. So he was one of the architects and the enforcers of the Reign of Terror. So guess what? One of his victims' sisters, he had ordered the assassination, or execution is the right word, sorry, of tens of thousands, just himself personally, and there's the names of some, but guess what? That's a fake list. So what's going on here? This was when one of these sisters, I think the man he had executed was named Cordray, but his sister was Charlotte. You don't have to know her name, but her name was, she's famous in French history. She decided to get revenge for her brother's murder. He was totally innocent, of course, of anything he was charged with. And so she dressed like a man. She hid a knife inside her jacket, and she created a fake list. This is brilliant how she did this and got away with it. Well, she didn't get away with it. She was executed, but how she managed to carry it out, this plot. So she made up a fake list of future enemies of the revolution, or sometimes they said enemies of the Republic. In other words, future victims that he could sign their death warrant for, because he loved signing people's death warrants. He enjoyed that process. So she got in to see him because of this. Whoever was at the door, I'm sure there was a guard of some kind of his, I'm sure it was a very nice, not poor person's apartment, some kind of apartment he lived in Paris. So she gained entrance to his apartment with the fake list, dressed as a man, and a hidden knife on her person. And as soon as he was distracted, reading the list and about to sign these death warrants, she took the knife out and stabbed him multiple times, and he bled to death in his own bathtub. You see the blood there. She actually stabbed him well more than once. That wouldn't have been enough to guarantee that he would die. Plus, that's above his, it's not even on the side where his heart is. Yeah. So I don't know why the artist didn't choose to show his body as cut up as it was, but I do think I know why. I'm not sure of this. Because the artist, David, admired Marat and was a defender of the Reign of Terror and the entire revolution and all its excesses. So in order to make the point, what's the meaning he intended for this? Oh, we should mourn the loss or death of Marat. He was a hero. He was defending the revolution. And it was a tragedy that he was killed by this crazy woman. Well, she was tried and executed, but not long after she died, her act of courage, it was an act of courage in some people's minds anyway. Let's say, she took a lot of obvious risk and she did pay for this act with her own life, to try and point out the excesses of the Reign of Terror. It did help bring it to an end earlier. I mean, it didn't end immediately, but within a few months it was over. And some of it had to do with her trial, because she was so famous once the word got out of what happened that they couldn't just execute her with no trial. So she did have a trial, and she was able to say why she thought she was justified. So, sometimes one person's act might be whatever you think of it, can change history. And it helped, her sacrifice. But of course, not everyone saw it that way. So he was viewed by many people, especially the artist who painted this scene, as a hero. See, there's the artist's name. So if it's on the exam, you have no reason to not be able to spell the title, right? The Death of Marat and David, the artist's name. And so this occurred at the height of the French Revolution, and it helped break the Reign of Terror, the incident itself, not the painting. And what is neoclassic about it? It's super sharp and realistic. There's none of those romantic, soft, fuzzy, right, diffused modeling here, or exaggerated colors even. The colors are accurate. The color of the blanket over, he had to live in his bathtub. I know that sounds but you don't have to write that, but it's true. He had such a bad skin disease that he'd hardly exist outside of some kind of a mineral-laced bath in his apartment. He had a very severe case of eczema, much worse than regular one. So that's where he was. She knew he'd be in his bathtub because he always was when she came into his apartment. In any case, he's shown realistically and sharp in detail. So that's the realistic and accurate part. The echo of classical art is he's posed in the same pose as many famous sculptures of ancient Roman soldiers and generals who died defending Rome. And of course, they called themselves a republic. Never mind, later they were a dictatorship under emperors. But Rome started out as a democracy, right? I mean, you probably know that. People voted for the Senate. So in the early days of Rome, there were many martyrs who were depicted as sculpture. They were in the Louvre. These exhibits, these museum pieces, these sculptures were seen by thousands of people every day. You know, the Louvre was already a museum, not open to the general public, but people could go see them. So many educated, just say people, the educated people in France already knew these sculptures and knew that they were symbolic of someone sacrificing their life to defend the quote republic, which is what the French reign of terror leaders, including Marat, called their system. Never mind, it was a dictatorship; they called it a republic. So he's the painting is the last fact now in the meeting is echoing that ancient Roman sculpture tradition. It wasn't just one figure. There's at least 3 or 4 I can think of in I think they're all in the Louvre or at least other museums in France. And those would have been known to people who looked at this. So he's being shown as a martyr. The artist wants us to mourn him and regret his passing. Most people would have cheered the average person when they found out he was dead. Okay, so formal analysis, super sharp, realistic simulated textures. For space, you have overlapping, right? And for shortening, I don't see diminishing size here. That's it. We don't know where the back wall is kind of an odd set of, just modeled splatter kind of colors, right? So that's not meant to be anything definitive. So there's no space technique behind him at all. He's the largest mass, or is he? Maybe it's a bathtub. Maybe it's a wooden box. It's hard to say, so you decide on that. Obviously, the lines are mostly thin. I mean, that's just shadow under his elbow there. Thin outlines. And then we have, it's mostly stable. You see, the line is pretty much upright. So only the lower part of his arms are dynamic, but the bathtub, the wooden box, the writing box is, and his upper body, those are almost all stable. The colors are warm on him, and of course the wooden box, cool on the note, and the cloth over the bathtub. Let's see, some of the texture I think I already mentioned, super sharp and realistic on the skin and the cloth and that wooden box. Let's see, balance, well, it's unbalanced toward the bottom, of course, and I would call it roughly balanced left to right. If that piece of paper was held upright, it would be totally balanced. So you could say that it's slightly or somewhat unbalanced toward the left, if you see it that way. Okay. Of course, I mentioned rhythm already. Right. Arms, hands, legs, the writing on the paper. All right. We're going to do one more and then we'll take a break. I'm going to have to go back to this because we can't do that in just 5 or 10 minutes. Let's go to. I wanted to do the French one. Well, maybe I have to go back. Yeah, hang on, because this is not in the order that oh, there we go. Yeah, here we go. So this is near the bottom of the list, but like I said, I can't necessarily have every, semester the list that stays the same. And this is all from Stockstead, which is, of course, way more slides than we would ever cover in a class like this. So this one is the next must know. Is Gericault, or Gericault, some people call him Gericault, Raft of the Medusa. Raft, of course, of the Medusa. That's the name of the boat the raft came from. Medusa, one word, Medusa. Like the ancient, the name comes from the ancient Greek Gorgon, wasn't she? Kind of a goddess who could turn men to stone. So Gericault, Raft of the Medusa, title 1819. So we're looking at a romantic painting. There's no question that this is romantic. There's nothing neoclassic about it. It's a soft kind of a diffused modeling, and there's an exaggeration of colors here. I mean, that should be obvious. Look at the sky. It's so extreme between the clouds and I've seen tornadoes. I'm from the Midwest, and the sky can get a little bit like that, but not that extreme and that high contrast from the horizon on up. It's exaggerated. The color of the water is exaggerated. The emotional component should be obvious. A struggle for survival, and I'll explain what's happening here in just a minute. The intense struggle of life and death, if you want to put it that way. And then we have the dynamic and imaginative composition. Well, this thing is totally, we'll do the formal analysis, of course, at the end, and then take our break. But there's no straight lines in it. I don't see any. So what does it depict? It depicts an incident that occurred at sea with a French passenger ship named the Medusa, of course, which got caught in a storm at sea. I'm saying this slowly so you can write this. And then the captain and the crew saved themselves first and took all the lifeboats and left hundreds of passengers to die on the sinking ship. But 75, we know this because this is a well-documented incident in the history of France. There's no debating these numbers and the facts. 75 of those passengers were able to take one remaining raft that had been left and get out to sea. And they were at sea for 9 days with no food and water. Well, you can imagine most of them, and I can tell you exactly how many, 80%, 4 out of 5. That means 15 survived and 60 died out of the 75. 4/5, where 80% of them died at sea. From what? Starvation? Yes, of course. Drinking the seawater, in other words, lack of drinkable water. You drink seawater, it'll kill you, right? I think everybody knows that. I mean, not immediately if you just take one drink, but if you go for days, it's going to kill you. The salt will kill you. And then there's this grisly detail, cannibalism. It mostly was with those who had already died and the survivors trying to stay alive any way they could, of course. It's human nature, eating the bodies of those who had died before them. But sometimes if someone was near death, they would be hurried along by one of their fellow survivors and therefore become food before they were ready. I mean, it was a grim, grisly, grotesque. There's your alliteration for tonight. Grim, grisly, grotesque incident that didn't have to happen because the crew should have let the passengers go and then they should have sacrificed themselves. And there were less of the crew. Of course, there were only a few dozen of the crew and there were hundreds of passengers. So most of the passengers died on the sinking ship, but these 15 of them survived. And here again, we have another freed, not slave, African passenger on the raft. And he was the one that signaled the boat. And there it is. Can you see where the arrow was? He's the one that maybe without him, if he hadn't had his sharp eyesight and a quick reaction, they might not have been saved because he was able to stand up and wave a shirt, a bright red shirt that got them saved. So what happened afterwards is the other part of the meaning. A trial occurred and a national scandal resulted because guess what? The ship was owned by a member of the royal family. The French had gone back to a royal family after the French Revolution, as you may know, and after Napoleon. For a while, they eventually lost that too. The royal family that came back and ruled for a few decades was finally kicked out. But at this point in time, they had a royal family again, and that family was, of course, rather corrupt, as often happens, usually. And they didn't make any effort to try and make sure that the boat had enough, the Medusa, right, had enough lifeboats on it, let alone tell the crew and the captain, if you're caught in a storm, save the passengers first. That's what you're supposed to do. They didn't care. So that caused a scandal. And it also led to a new law. This is the last part of the meeting now. In French Assembly, they call it, right? It's their version of Congress. So the French government, you could just say it that way, but it was actually called the Assembly, passed a new rule that all French ships, when they set out to sea, have to have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Okay, so that's almost the whole. May I actually describe why it's romantic style? So you've got the whole meaning now. We'll wrap up with the formal analysis in just a few seconds. But can anybody think of an incident that occurred 100 years roughly after this of a different country, the British Isles, where lifeboats was a big issue.
Titanic.
Yes, they had enough. You probably know it sounds like many of you do. This tragic story. There were enough lifeboats on the deck when it was being built. It was made to have enough lifeboats, but there was no law then requiring them in the British Isles, whereas there had been in France for almost a century. So if it had been a French ship, you probably would have saved most of those people. In any case, they were removed before the ship went to sea because supposedly it ruined the sight line of some of the passengers or the crew or whoever ran the company that ran the steamship, whatever it was, the boat, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of a different shipwreck when I saw this.
Mm-hmm.
The USS Indianapolis.
Oh yeah, that was a
You familiar
shark
with that?
infested. Yeah. I know. I have relatives who are World War II veterans. Well, they passed away. Most actually, two of them are still alive. Who weren't on that ship. No, they weren't. But they heard all about it. They were both in the Navy. They're in their 90s now, and that was one of the most preventable. They could have saved those people. Anyway, you don't need to write all that. You could just say that the French were the first European country to pass a law requiring enough lifeboats for every boat under their flag. But the Brits didn't do it for almost a century until after the Titanic. Right. Okay, formal analysis, we'll take our break. It's balanced. I mean, roughly, of course, you've got this peak here and this peak here, right? The man with the shirt, the sail, and then of course you've got the bodies almost evenly distributed across the dead and dying bodies across the raft. The rhythm is obvious with all the human body parts, right, and the waves and clouds. The colors are warm on the skin tones and the raft, and I would say cool on almost everything else. The clouds, the water, right, and the dead bodies. Certainly, they've already turned to a color that isn't warm anymore. It's not a warm skin tone if you get dead flesh, right? You see that there. And then, of course, it's dynamic. I already said it's not a single straight line in it. And for space, here you have overlapping, foreshortening, and diminishing size. And you might make the case that just on the boat that's coming, that tiny blip on the horizon, there is a bit of atmospheric perspective because it's slightly bluish. You could, but that's minimal. I wouldn't say that's a major part of it. But there's definitely vanishing point, overlapping, foreshortening, and diminishing size. And then the largest mass is probably the water, but it's actually not as much of the water visible as there was in the Watson and Sharp painting. So maybe it's the raft then. And then I guess the waves, if you count them as one mass or however you do, and then maybe the sail of the boat. Okay, and then thin outline around everything. And let's see, I already said the texture and modeling, right? The modeling is soft and diffused as most romantic paintings are. And the cement textures are sharp and realistic on the skin, the hair, the clothing, and the raft. Okay, let's take our break. We'll call it 8:05. So 8:20 we'll resume. Okay, I'll see you guys in about just over, well, now it's going to be 15 minutes by the time I pause the recording. Okay, we have a couple of really important ones coming up, and one of the most important slides you'll see this whole semester in this class. The slave ship is our last one, so that one you really want to be here, and we'll try to end a little early. We'll see how it goes. All right, well, I'll see you guys in a minute. Okay, welcome back. And this actually isn't the next must know, but it is in direct relation to that. So I'll go ahead and tell you the title of the next must know, which is slide right after this, same artist. And you don't have to write notes about this one, but you just follow what I'm going to mention, just a couple of minutes of context. And then when we get to the must know, of course, you need to start taking notes. The artist for the next must know is Goya, Goya, and the title of that slide, the one right after this, will be the 3rd of May, 1808. That's the full title of the painting. So remember that. The title of this painting, I'll go ahead and show it to you here real quick. It's coming up. This one is, again, includes, I should say, the date of the event. The 3rd of May, 1808. The date of that painting, though, so again, let's go take that it was completed, it was a decade later. That's why I put it in parentheses. I hope that clarifies. Date of the painting, of course, was 1814. In other words, he painted it several years after the incident. Okay, but what was it about and who was Goya? Well, let's start out with Goya was by far, I mean, no one debates this, the greatest Spanish romantic painter of all time. Well, that implies that you don't have to write that part of it. You can, again, just say it that way. Goya was the most famous Spanish romantic painter. Some think of period ever that ever lived. That's a matter of opinion. But there's no debating the fact that he was the most, famous and successful of all Spanish romantic painters. He started out painting portraits, first of people, he knew, friends and acquaintances, and then he was assigned or given the job, you can say it that way, of court painter to the King of Spain. That's what this is. This is not the must know, but just follow me here. This was right before the French invasion of Spain. France had already had its revolution, but Spain was still totally a monarchy under this guy here, who some people think looks like a fat George Washington. I've heard people say that. You get up close, it doesn't look so much like the same images that you see on the dollar bill. But anyway, and the point is, this is his family. This is a portrait of Charles I think it's the sixth. There were so many Charles in French history. Sorry, I keep saying French, in Spanish royal history. So it's one of the Charleses, the portrait of the family, the royal family of Spain. You don't have to know about the title or any of the facts, but you should understand the context because it'll make the next slide more clear, the meaning. So he was corrupt and hated by his citizens, his population. His family was dysfunctional, and Goya managed to capture that brilliantly in this painting. Since it's not a must-know, I'll keep it to a minimum of a few facts. There is Goya himself, the artist, and I think you can tell he's disapproving of this whole group of people. Look at this person here. She was the queen mother to the queen, and the queen was an abusive parent towards her youngest children, at least. This little boy literally is traumatized. You can see these things in their faces. Well, the people of Spain knew all this about their royal family, and the artist is capturing that, and they're so clueless, they don't get that he's criticizing them while he's being employed to paint their picture. I think it's brilliant. And the corruption of this king here, shown almost not in human form here, was so intense that people, all knew about that. And then this guy, his brother here, look at him. He wants to take the throne. He's hoping that his older brother will die, or he can help him die early. The whole family, which is this is one of the few people in the family that he doesn't, Goya, portray with disrespect. She's one of the older daughters of the queen, who's so embarrassed to be seen with the rest of this dysfunctional family. She's looking away. But maybe not mine, his favorite and only respected couple in the whole royal family by the people of Spain was the son, the oldest son, his wife, and their baby. They are shown with respect and dignity. Okay, let's move on now to the must know. Oh, does that a lot. Sorry. Wow, this is a powerful image. If you don't know what it depicts, then of course you'll need to write this context. So after the French invaded Spain under Napoleon, the first reaction of Spain was the people of Spain, obviously not the royal family, he took the country away from them, was happiness, was support, however you want to say that. They thought relief. Oh, good. They're bringing independent democracy to Spain. I guess they weren't paying attention to what was happening in France. So just write it this way, that the French army invaded Spain under Napoleon, and then Napoleon installed his brother as a new king, just as bad or worse than the one they got rid of. And he then, Napoleon's brother, had the army enforce the dictatorship that he ran over Spain. One night, that's what this depicts now, one night in Madrid, of course, it's the biggest city in the capital. I think everybody knows that, of Spain, right? This occurred in Madrid. One night in Madrid, a French patrol, French soldiers on patrol, were shot at by someone from a window of an upper story. And the reaction of the local French commander was to arrest every male in that entire neighborhood, for blocks around, because they couldn't tell where the shot came from, right? They arrested every male over the age of 15. It was something like 1,500 of them, and marched them up a hill on the, outer, it's probably in a park or something. They just say up a hill, in the nearby hill, and shot them to death, massacred them. This is a war crime. There's no other word for that, of course. Back then, that phrase may or may not have existed. I'm not sure, but the concept did. And that is what this depicts. One of the most infamous war crimes of the Napoleonic era. Well, Napoleon himself was guilty of hundreds of war crimes. I don't know about what you know about French history, but he's admired by some of the older citizens of France, but the younger people get it. The man was a mass murderer and a dictator. What's to admire about that? Not much. Just because he was French and spread the French language and French laws around Europe. Look what he did to Haiti, Pierre Le Toussaint, if you know, right? The guy that finally got Haiti independent of the French Empire, massacred thousands of his followers because he dared to try and get freedom, which is what the French said they were in favor of. You know this. The phrase the French Revolution had was equality, fraternity, and basically freedom for everybody. And that's not how it played out in reality. So these people were victims of Napoleon's dictatorship and his brothers, what can you say, repressive policies. And they were shown as victims in a powerful, shocking way. Oh, darn it. I can't keep trying to get that to get, here we go. Sometimes it'll go closer, sometimes it won't. There we go. You can see the looks on the faces of them. Even priests are being executed here. No one's being spared that's over 15. Being marched to the top of this, hill, and there's more victims waiting, and being shot in mass murder. That's all. It's an act of mass murder. Terrorism, if you want to call it that, by an occupying army. Because someone among that neighborhood, one, maybe a couple of people decided to resist by taking a pot shot at the French soldiers. And this is how they were treated or repaid, if you want to put it that way, by being executed by the hundreds. So the outrage here, obviously there's a romantic painting, but if it is totally clear, here are the three features that mark it as a romantic style painting, which is the last part of the meaning now. Oh boy, look at the simulated textures here. I mean, his shirt's glowing. The blood is almost phosphorescent. I mean, of course, these are exaggerated colors, bold, vivid, exaggerated colors. Then there is the emotional component, moral outrage. What other phrase would there be for this? If you have any conscience and you knew this event happened, let alone look at this painting. I've seen it. It's in Madrid, by the way, in the Prado Museum. You should go there sometime. If you like art and you're traveling in Europe and you get to Spain, spend a day at the Prado. It's the third largest art museum, I think, in size in the world, but also I'd say one of the top three in quality. This painting is there. Students from all over the world, every time, I've been to the Prado 3 times, and every time there was groups of dozens of art students, as in studio art, right, sketching it so they could go home and make a copy because it's that famous, right? It's part of their assignments, right? So it's a world famous painting. And then we have the emotional, again, quote again, is moral outrage over this act of terror, war crime. And then, of course, it's a dynamic and imaginative composition. The only thing stable about it are the soldiers' upper arms and their rifles. Even the rest of their bodies aren't. They're actually almost like robots. In fact, the word robot existed, by the way, back then. I don't know if you know, that word goes way back. The concept of what a robot is, not the metal, humanoid looking thing, machines, but the concept of robot-like behavior. So these are robots of death, one of the critics who wrote about this painting. Oh, this painting became famous all over Europe, but not at the time. Why? Well, here's the last thing about the meaning. Goya, by this time, obviously had become anti-monarchy, right? He had become a supporter of, resistance, however you want to call that, of democracy and of freedom. So when he was told about this incident, he didn't dare paint it because Napoleon's soldiers would have arrested him, tortured him, and then executed him. Would have ended his career, right? So he sketched it in his secret, and he didn't show those sketches to more than a few friends. So a few people knew about it. But because it was so powerful, the image, even his sketch of it, that the people of Spain were outraged when they heard what happened. And then they saw prints were made from his sketches. So that's the last major fact about the meaning. Why I said some works of art influence history. I've already given you the one about the raft, right, of the Medusa. This one, how did it influence history? Directly by being copied, not the painting. The painting didn't exist, but the etching of it. He did etchings, is what he did. And he was a superb uh, printmaker. And so he didn't do it, but people took, I guess, with his permission, the original image and managed to reproduce it by the thousands. And it was distributed all over Spain. This scene, slightly different details, of course, because it was an engraving, right? Is that the word? Etching, engraving, I guess, in which, some of the details might not have been exactly, but it was basically the same as the painting later. The painting was not painted until 1814 for the obvious reason that Napoleon's soldiers had to be kicked out of Spain first because it would have been safe to stand there and paint. It's a wall-size painting. It has a whole wall to itself at the Prado. It's huge. It's life-size, the figures. So he wouldn't dare be doing that. He'd have to obviously give himself away and been arrested and executed. So he waited until Napoleon's soldiers were kicked out of Spain, partly due to his original image, which was reproduced as copies of engravings and distributed all over Spain to help ignite a rebellion. And the final fact about this, my tongue's not working. The final fact about this is that the people of Spain have every reason, you don't have to write this, but it's a fact that relates to this image, have every reason to be proud of the fact that they are the first country in all of Europe out of the dozens that Napoleon conquered, occupied, and oppressed. He didn't bring freedom to anybody. To rebel successfully against Napoleon. They're the first country to do that. It took them 3 years to kick his soldiers back over the mountains into France, the Pyrenees that divide France and Spain. So once again, this helped inspire the first, you just keep it simple, one line at the end of your meaning notes, that this painting, the engravings, or the image of this painting as an engraving, were reproduced and help inspire the first successful rebellion against French occupation, or no, you should say Napoleon, specifically Napoleon's occupying soldiers, helped inspire millions of people in Spain to resist, armed struggle, and they succeeded. The rest of Spain, of Europe, was still under Napoleon's control. The only two countries other than that weren't were, of course, England and Russia, and they led to his downfall, obviously. Okay, so you see how paintings, works of art, various versions of them can influence history. Okay, formal analysis, this is pretty straightforward. It is balanced brilliantly left to right, this group and this next set of victims right dead in the middle. And of course, it depends on if you count the sky as mass, but most people wouldn't, so you would probably think of it as I do, balanced, I would say unbalanced toward the bottom, of course. The colors are warm on the blood, and this man's pants and all the skin tones and some of the other clothing of the soldiers and the victims, but mostly cool on the background and on this man's shirt and, of course, some of the other clothing. The lines are very diffused. There are thin and bold outlines here, bold around the soldiers and thinner around the victims, but they're soft. They're not super sharp, either the bold or the thin lines. It's deliberate, of course, as is the semantic texture and the modeling. In this case, he went diffused. He was using a diffused effect on all three: the lines or outlines, the modeling, and the semantic textures. But they are realistic. It's dynamic. I think I've said there's only one section, really. I only think of it as, well, their arms maybe and the rifles of the soldiers. Every other object is pretty well. You could say this steeple here, maybe, of that church in the background. Almost entirely dynamic. For space, you have overlapping, foreshortening, diminishing size, and atmospheric perspective. Of course, that's atmospheric. atmospheric perspective in the background. It's probably some of the apartments from which these people were dragged in the middle of the night in their sleep up the hill to face death. Yeah, can you just imagine what that would have been like? Okay, and then let's see, what are we missing? Rhythm, of course, the repeated shapes of the rifles of this machine, killing machine, or robots of death, as that one critic called it when he saw the print of this, which is what they were acting like. That creates, of course, rhythm, as do their uniforms. And then, of course, look at this rhythm. I think it's brilliant. Maybe the most original touch in this painting is the parallel rhythm of the most recent victim and the next victim. Look at their arms stretched out exactly the same, as well as arms, hands over faces. So the rhythm is very, very powerful here. And the largest mass, probably the rock. I assume it's a rock or hill. You could just say hill behind them. And then you decide, maybe it's the group of soldiers as a single mass. And then this group of the next set of victims, perhaps. All right, moving on. We have to skip ahead because this is not in the exact order. Oh yeah, here we go. Sorry, almost. This is the next must know. Very different scene, totally different. And it is the artist's name is Constable near the bottom of your list for tonight. Constable, Constable, the Haywain, 2 words. That means hay wagon in English. Oops, internet connection is slightly, give me a second for it to reclaim. Okay, it should be back now. The Haywain, 1 word. Haywain. Okay, and this is by the artist's name is Constable. I already mentioned his name, and the date is 1821. Okay, Constable was the most famous English landscape painter of his era. You can't say ever because there have been generations of them. Of course, hundreds of years of landscape painting since at least the 1600s all over Europe. The Dutch were even more famous for landscapes 200 years before this. So I'll say that again. Who was Constable? He was the most famous English landscape painter of his time, and say one of, you can't say the most, just one of the most famous English romantic painters. Remember, romantic painting isn't only of people or landscapes or events, it's of any subject. It's a style, of course, it makes something romantic. So the style of this is romantic. We'll say how in a minute, but let's talk also first, about what's going on. There's not a lot happening here, and yet there is, because if you know the point or the reason behind this painting, then you know that it's trying to convey an important message. It's the English countryside right before a storm. As you see, the clouds are gathering. There's going to be a downpour soon, and this is a father. I can never tell if it's a father and son. To me, it looks like, maybe, a teenage son. It could be just 2 other adults heading home, trying to get home before the storm hits. And then they're passing, fording is the word they use. Crossing is probably the easiest way to say, crossing a creek here. And they are heading towards somewhere in the distance, hopefully before the storm hits. And they're passing this farm here where you can see a dog from that house is noticing their presence. And then there's probably the wife of the family that owns that farm. Some people think they're heading for this farm, but there's no indication of that. You can just say they're trying to get home before the storm hits. So it's an idyllic, is a good word to use. Idyllic, just write that how it sounds. Or, perfect, scene from rural England. If that's all it was, we might have forgotten it, but it's one of the most famous paintings from that century by any British artist. Why? Because he's trying to convey an important message here in a not, today is not obvious, but at the time it would have been not so subtle way. What he's really saying is the English countryside. I don't know if any of you have traveled, I think some of you have, right, to Britain by train or car or bus across the English countryside, not just London. If you get outside London, I love London, it's a great city, but if you get into the countryside, you can see why they're so beloved of their countryside, of their landscape. The English landscape is beautiful. It's why people from all over the world have come there to paint it for centuries. And Shakespeare wrote, all kinds of poetry about it. It's beautiful. And so what's his message? Constable, the artist, is saying we should, value, there we go, value the beauty of our English countryside and protect it against what was happening at this time in England. You know, the development, there's a phrase for it. It's actually two words. Some kind of a
It was the
revolution.
Industrial
Yeah,
Revolution. It was
exactly.
just getting
Exactly.
started in
Yeah.
England.
Yeah. So that's the word. I'll say it again. Thank you. The Industrial Revolution was an explosion. I was going to say expansion. It's an explosion of, manufacturing and development all over the British Isles. Everything from coal mines to railroads, which of course belch steam and smoke and soot into the air. Cities were expanding, factories were being built, and of course, Dickens wrote about what that effect had on people in the cities. Their lives were miserable until they got organized, right? Anyway, the point is that there was all this, encroachment of developments from the industrial portion of the British Isles, or you could say economy of the British economy, which was in danger of destroying many sections of the British countryside if he didn't fight to protect it. So environmental protection wasn't even a phrase back then, but it was a concept. And he was someone who very vigorously thought that people who cared about the beauty of the countryside and the environment itself should fight to protect it. And his paintings conveyed that feeling. And now they're looked at by most people as just beautiful, idyllic scenes of what life was like 200 years ago in the British Isles. In fact, it's ironic, it's exactly 200 years old now, this painting. It's one of the first paintings you'll see if you go into the British Museum. It's got not a whole wall to itself, but a very prominent place. It's not one of those small paintings like a lot of the Renaissance ones at that museum are. Remember the wedding portrait, that tiny little thing I told you about that, or Mona Lisa even. This is a pretty good size painting, not life size, but large and prominent. It's very famous, especially in England, but to other students of art like now, hopefully all of you. Okay, and I picked it because I could have picked several different ones from Constable. He did hundreds of paintings during his lifetime, but this is probably his most famous. Okay, formal analysis, completely balanced. Left to right and top to bottom? No, probably not. But there are people who consider the clouds as having volume and or mass. So if you do consider those as having mass, then you could say, well, even then this might be where the patch of blue is empty space. So either way, you could just simplify and say, well, the solid objects, the landscapes, all below, or mostly below the middle line. So therefore, you would have to say that it is unbalanced toward the bottom. And you could make the case these trees create bigger mass. I see this set of clouds as the same mass as these trees. So to me, it's balanced left to right and unbalanced or weighted toward the bottom. But if you feel differently and it's on the exam, that's fine if you explain it the way you see it. The rhythm is obvious with the trees, the trunks and the branches, the ripples in the water, the plants along the shoreline, the clouds, and of course the wagon creates rhythm. Cement textures are all pretty realistic. There's a slight softness to some of them, but not really. Maybe the human figures particularly, I guess all three of them, and maybe the dog. But it's fairly realistic on cement texture on the landscape itself. He wants you to focus on the landscape more than the people. And then we have the modeling. Oh, that's an important, it's a technique of his called a signature motif. I've mentioned that phrase. It's a good one to have. I'm going to keep using it. You'll hear it a lot between now and the final when we get to Impressionism, especially next week, actually. Techniques that an artist creates of their own that makes their work distinct. Signature motif. His signature motifs were cloudscapes. Look how realistic that is. Super realistic cloudscapes. And the other one was of his signature motifs was the alternating use of light and dark across his landscapes, which creates the effect of drawing your vision, you could say, or your sight into the distance. You see how that, here there's some of it on the water, a little more as a creek, looks like a pond forming at the edge of a river here, or the end of a river. And then you see the light and dark alternating. So he did these patches of light and dark, alternating light and dark areas, which is the technique of modeling, obviously, which recede into the distance and draw your attention towards the horizon. So you've got that, and then the modeling on everything else, pretty much straightforward on the wagon and on this house, right? Pretty realistic. The lines are all thin. The largest mass, it's hard to say. It'd be the clouds if you think of them as one mass. Otherwise, maybe the water. This really is a pond, isn't it? Not, yeah, because it's too wide to be just part of the creek. And then perhaps the house or this group of trees, if you count them as a single mass, and then the wagon. For space, you've got all the major techniques of realistic space. Overlapping, of course. Diminishing size. Foreshortening on the wagon, and to some degree on the house, the side of the farmhouse. And of course, scientific perspective, probably passing point right about there. And there's definitely atmospheric perspective. You see that in the distance. Okay, the rhythm is obvious with the trees. I think I've said that in the spokes of the wagon. Let's see. Oh, the colors are cool on the landscape, except where the sun hits, and then maybe there's flowers in this meadow. So in parts of the grassland or meadow, you see kind of warm colors, and in the sky, they're all, of course, off white, gray, and blue are all cool colors. And then the farmhouse is a mixture of warm and cool. The wagon is entirely warm, and the shoreline is warm. Okay, I already said the line is thin. Now we have to go to another. Oh, actually, we have one more must know on this selection, and then we have. I'm going to cut one of the remaining, but there's at least two more that are pretty important. Another David, and one of the only other woman artists from this period that we have slides of, and we'll probably end with that. Okay, but I will cut at least one of the remaining slides, but let's do this one first. This is one of the most important ones. If I had to say the two most important ones from tonight, it would be this one, Turner, just like it sounds, Turner, The Slave Ship, 1839. And the other one that's equally important is Copley, Watson, and the Shark. But, you know, I can't say which other of the others I might cut, but definitely not cutting this one. Let's start with who was Turner. The greatest British romantic artist ever, or you could say of all time. No, nobody argues with that. There used to be a debate over that, but not anymore. There have been movies made about him, documentaries, books, many books written about him, plays. He was a Cockney. Now, don't ask me to spell it. It's like it sounds with a CK in the middle. One of those lower class, working class Brits who came from the poor side of London. And if you don't know, London doesn't have as much of a divide anymore between East and West, but there's a part of London when he grew up 250 years ago, in the late 1700s, which was really a dismal area to live in, East London. So you could just say he was Cockney from the lowest class in British society, and he taught himself how to paint. Now, he did eventually get some tutoring when he was able to save some money, but mostly he taught himself. And he not only rose from poverty to become very famous, but he was accepted in the British Royal Academy, which was usually reserved for wealthy, connected people, because he was so good and so popular. Why? Because of two major things that distinguish him from all the other British painters, including other British romantic painters. His techniques, which took Romanticism to another level, even more diffused is really the best word. Remember that's DIF, not DE. We're not talking about a bomb here. Diffused simulated textures and modeling are extreme in his painting. And at the time, critics, many, just say many, not all, but many critics ridiculed him for that, saying, what's wrong with him? Can't he see or paint clearly? And stuff like that. Did he wake up, from a bad hangover? And, stupid stuff like that. Of course, critics, God love them. They can't create their own works of art, but they love to attack other people's. Yeah, he was criticized all through his career, but other artists respected him. Some critics did. And even much of the upper classes who paid for and collected many paintings, but mostly his paintings were popular with the middle classes, the majority of the population by now in England. Well, certainly by the time he died, had become middle class. They weren't well-to-do, but they could appreciate his work, and they would go see it in museums and galleries all over England. So he was self-made, basically as an artist came from the poorest classes in British society, and he never, this is one of the things I've always admired about him, he never gave up his Cockney accent, nor his downbeat way of dressing. He never put on airs. In other words, he could have, he became wealthy and successful. I mean, he didn't stay in that poor section of London. He did move into a nicer neighborhood, but you can't fault him for that. But he never put on airs. He would talk with the same Cockney accent that some British actors, why am I forgetting his name? Michael, oh my God, there are times when I have to wonder about this late at night. Sometimes my memory doesn't do me service. I'll come up with his name at the end of the class. One of the most famous British actors who won several Academy Awards, who has a thick accent in every role he plays. He hasn't put on airs either. So it's unusual though. Usually when you come from a poor, a section of society and you make it into the top echelon of your profession, you're going to adopt their ways of living. He did not. He dressed the same, he talked the same, and he kept the same friends. But here's what makes this painting individually his most powerful, influential, famous, you could put all of the above, but certainly say his most famous, and I think you should add influential painting. Out of all the hundreds of paintings he did, this is the one that had the most impact. Why? Here we go. The other part of the meaning is what's it depicting? The title gives you a clue. This is an incident that occurred at sea in the 1700s, before his time. I mean, he was born in the late 1700s, but he was painting in 1839. So it's like decades, just say decades earlier or the previous century. You could say it that way. This incident occurred at sea with a British slave ship during the previous century. It was caught in a storm off in the Caribbean, I believe. I can just say at sea, keep it simple. It was caught in a storm at sea on its way to what? Sell the slaves, of course. And the captain saw many of the slaves becoming sick and injured because the storm, of course, was tossing the ship around, and it wasn't going to end. It was like a long, long storm. He could see them being injured, and therefore he threw 133 of them overboard. Get this, here's why. If you don't know the story about this, you need to write this exactly. Some of you already know or you can guess. He threw that many overboard, the injured ones, because he knew that if he arrived with injured slaves, he A, couldn't sell them, and B, couldn't get any insurance for them. But if they died at sea, he got paid for each one that died. If that isn't as sick as anything could be, I can't think of anything sicker than that. And of course, it was legal back then. This is the late 1700s. So he showed up with 133 less slaves, and all I had to do was say, oh, they died at sea, and he got a check for each one. And that's why this painting is so powerful, because at the time that Turner decided to paint it, the British Parliament, this is a really important fact, how it influenced history, yeah, it did. Indirectly, of course, but not an unimportant role in the debate in Parliament that lasted for several years during that decade. He was painting this painting for years on and off. Now, when he finished it, the debate was over. Slavery had been outlawed throughout the British Empire by 1836, I think it was, or sometime that decade. So a few years earlier. But he was starting to paint this. He was sketching stuff, and researching for a long time before. He wanted, in other words, to enter a work of art that would evoke the horror of slavery and the inhumanity of it to the British people. And several members of Parliament came to see him. He was so famous. His studio was, a place where people would come and visit with his permission, of course. So some members of Parliament, before they voted the final time about whether to end slavery in the British Empire, actually they'd ended it in some of the colonies. You just say the total ban of slavery throughout the British Empire, including in Britain itself. In other words, if you owned a slave, you had to free them immediately. So he wanted this image, to be a part of the debate. And several members of Parliament came to see it. And there's no proof of this because none of them said, I'm changing my vote from pro to con, on slavery because I saw Turner's painting. And of course, you can't make a direct connection like that. But there's evidence that there was influence because once you look at what you're really seeing here, these slaves, dismembered legs and things, others here gasping for air. Of course, they had their chains on, so of course they had no chance. And some being eaten by flesh-eating fish. I don't know if they were piranhas, I'm not sure, but in any case, all of this actually happened because the captain and the crew reported it. There was, no law against what he did, right? So they didn't hide it. And he's saying, you know what? Look at the sky. This is the last part of the meaning now. His choice of exaggerated colors and diffuse modeling and completely dynamic and imaginative composition, obviously it is, he wasn't there. And the emotional component is, again, moral outrage taken to the nth degree, which is, here's what he said about why he chose to make the sky. See how much red, there's almost like blood in the air, not even the clouds, the sunset, all of it. God is angry with us is one of the phrases he was attributed. Now, I don't know if he ever acknowledged that, but when he painted it, he wanted to convey that feeling for, of course, this inhumanity to fellow human beings. He was a lifelong abolitionist, by the way. He wasn't a late convert to it. He opposed it from when he was a young man. So he's a hero to a whole bunch of people. And the final little footnote, I think it's not minor. You could add this if you want, you don't have to. As part of the meaning is what happened to the painting. It ain't in Britain. It's not in any British museum. It's in Boston because nobody in Britain would buy it. Probably even those who agreed with the message were ashamed or uncomfortable. And those who didn't, of course, were offended. So what happened? An American abolitionist, one of Frederick Douglass's first friends who helped him get his publishing career started. You know, Douglass published several books. You probably know that, not just autobiographies. But when Douglass first arrived as an escaped slave, I mean, he didn't know anybody, so he was befriended by William Lloyd Garrison. There's someone whose name you should know, and I bet most history classes in 19th century American history barely mention him. He's the first American abolitionist to organize the society way back around 1810. And then by the time we get to the Civil War, he was still quite active. He helped push Lincoln faster into emancipating slaves. So just, if you want to write in one sentence, wrap up the meaning, then we'll do a formal analysis and then switch to 2, maybe 3 other slides. Okay, but to wrap up that last point, you could just say the painting ended up being sold to an American abolitionist, and it is now on display in a museum in Boston because of that. Okay, so here we go, formal analysis. Well, I almost think of this as mass, but really it is kind of the empty area above the bloody clouds in the sky. So yeah, you'd have to say it's weighted toward the bottom, and you could make the case it's also unbalanced toward the left because of the number of clouds and the spray from the ocean. I already said some of this, but I'll repeat it. Obviously, when it comes to modeling, that's his forte. That's a signature motif. An exaggerated, diffused effect on even on the most, I've stood to look at this painting for a long time at that museum. It's the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, by the way, that owns it. That's the most solid object here, is a dismembered leg of one of the victims, the slaves that had been tossed into the raging sea to their death. So even there, the semi texture is a little diffused, but most of it is extremely diffused, as is the modeling. That's his, again, signature motif. You could say hallmark of all of his paintings, but even more so here. The colors, of course, are warm on this lower part of the sky, or the far left, and on the dying slaves, the reflection of the sunlight, but then the sea, most of the sea itself is cool, as are the flesh-eating fish, and of course the waves crashing on the boat. There is almost no line here, not even on the closest section of the slaves. Look carefully, there's no outline here, but you could say the masts form a kind of a line, and they are also dynamic. There isn't a straight line in this. I mean, even though these are lines, the masts here, they're all at a diagonal, so I don't see anything stable. For here, you do have a scientific perspective. It may not be obvious, but it'd be at the point where the sun hits the horizon and reflects on the water. So there is a vanishing point, and it is balanced. I'm sorry, let me say, sorry, it also has, so you could say this is atmospheric perspective if you want, but I see it more as the effect of the ocean, the waves, I should say, hitting the boat and diffused, but maybe that's some limited section or area. of atmospheric perspective. And it definitely has foreshortening, on at least like this one leg here and some of the water, overlapping obviously and diminishing size on the dead and dying slaves. And then let's see, are we missing anything here? Balance, rhythm is obvious with all the body parts and the waves. Okay, so we're going to do, we're doing pretty well on time. We should be in a little early, but I'm going to decide, and so don't do it yet, but as soon as I get to the other, I have to hit stop share. Some of you know how this works, right? And then pull up this set. It won't take too long, shouldn't, of slides here. Whoops. There we go. Neoclassicism and Romaticism. These are ones that weren't in Stockstead, and yet they are important. Here we go. We'll start with this one and go backwards. Well, one of these was in Stockstead. Okay, but to get this to where you can see it, I know what I had to hang on, because you probably can't see it yet until I do the screen share. So now this should work here. Share screen. Okay, here we go. All right, can people see this? Can you guys see this?
Yeah, I can see it.
Good, yeah. Yes? Right, I hope, because it says I am screen sharing, and I did the same steps last week, as you may recall, and a couple other times, to get to where you could see it. We're going to do only 3 more, and we'll end still a little bit early, and then I'll stick around as long as you guys need for me to answer questions. Don't forget your papers are due 2 weeks from tonight, and you should be already researching them, and pretty soon you should start writing the text, and you can forward a sample of what you've written to me if you want before the due date. Don't wait till the night before it's due for feedback if you would like. Okay, this one is David. Remember I told you there were 2 of his, 2 must-knows. Death of Socrates. Socrates, you may know the other way to pronounce it is Socrates. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I don't remember that movie. Socrates. Okay, so Death of Socrates. David, or David is how we pronounce it. 1787. Here we have the same artist, so I don't think I have to repeat too much about who he was. Again, he was the most famous. Of course, some people joined us a little later. So he was the most famous French neoclassic painter ever. This is so obviously an accurately, historically, I meant to say historically accurate painting, because the togas, right, on all the people here, this is ancient Greece, as you should know already, but if you don't, Socrates was one of the most famous ancient Greek philosophers, and he died at his own hands because the government of Athens tried him for treason because he was criticizing the government of his own city. They told him to stop. He wouldn't. He was tried, found guilty, sentenced to death, and then given the choice. We'll execute you in the morning, or you can take poison the night before. He took the poison. Here it is. That's what this shows. The moment in which he chose to die for his beliefs. See, he's pointing upward. He's saying the truth is worth dying for. That's a pretty powerful message. So when David painted this, the French Revolution was still a couple of years away. This is all part of the meaning and pretty important parts of it too. So if you need me to repeat any of this, let me know. But I'm trying to get, to where we can end a little early tonight for all your sakes. So in other words, it takes a moment in history, ancient history, in which every detail in this painting, the oil lamps, the stone wall of the prison he's in, even the furniture and the robes they're wearing. And we know what Socrates looked like because there were coins, there were some kind of images of him, both coins and I believe sculpture of him while he was alive. So it's pretty close to what we think he really looked like. In other words, it's an accurate and authentic revival of an ancient classical setting, which is the prison the night that Socrates took poison, to make the point that he wasn't afraid of dying for truth. He's the original question authority guy. You know that bumper sticker? Well, it's very popular in Berkeley. I don't know about Santa Rosa. I still see it, question authority from all the way back when I was a student. I remember seeing it even then before I owned a car. Who's the original question authority guy? You got to say it's Socrates. And he paid for it with his life, but he was brave, you could say, or courageous enough to not, he could have been, actually some of his followers, and these are his students here, including Aristotle, by the way. I believe it's Aristotle. Do I have Aristotle or Plato? I can never just say his followers who went on to become philosophers themselves. They were learned by him. Were taught by him, and they learned from him. There we go. To question, anything and everything. It's some people say he's the father of the scientific method of inquiry. That is, what scientists use to discover, at least if they're honest about their research, how they discover new, things is questioning things and then recording the, evidence. So he taught that method of questioning everything around you. Don't just take things on face value or blindly accept something that someone tells you. Pretty early on, 2,300 or 400 years ago. Yes, over 23 centuries ago. Okay, so it depicts a moment in history, which there's one last part about the meaning, which is this is 2 years before the French Revolution began. And the point of the moral lesson here is that we, that is the people of France, should be ready and willing to die for our own freedom, just like Socrates was. Because anybody with any education, any intelligent, educated person, except Marie Antoinette and her husband, the king, and maybe some other royal family members, but most people in France, at least among the educated classes, knew a revolution was inevitable, that it was going to happen, and it would be violent, and people would have to take sides. So he's saying, when that happens, we need to be prepared, those of us who want to fight for our own freedom, to die if need be, if necessary, the way Socrates did. Okay, that's the whole meaning. Formal analysis. Well, let's see. I think it's pretty obviously balanced left to right to me, but because there are figures fading off into the distance here, and here it's just the edge of this wall, but I think it's a rough balance because then you got to add these figures in this section of the staircase. I think it's roughly balanced that way, side to side, but definitely unbalanced, of course, toward the bottom. The rhythm is obvious with the figures, arms, hands, legs, the stones, and the wall. But look carefully about stable versus dynamic. It's almost entirely stable. Really, even his whole body, as his arms are, and the wall behind him. The figures are mostly sitting upright. This one is leaning over, that's true. One of his legs is totally upright. Or stretched down in a straight line. This one is tilted. It's mostly stable. Even the oil lamp behind them is. But there are a few dynamic details. I guess slightly dynamic upper body here and this guy's upper body. These couple of the mourners, right? Simulated texture. Now here we're not looking at anything diffuse. Remember, that's the main difference between neoclassic style paintings and romantic. Is the diffuse simulated textures and modeling of romantic paintings. This is all super sharp simulated texture. You see it on his face, the beard, his skin, the togas, that's what they are. Yeah, right. You just say the clothing and the wall behind them. And the same is true for the modeling. It's very strong and realistic on this archway here, on the, under the bed and all around their clothing and their bodies. Colors are warm on the human figures mostly, and some of the togas. And I guess the bed, the wall behind them, of course, is cool. And then some of the clothing, his robes, and this older follower on that side, the floor. So more of the overall section or areas of the painting are cool colors than warm. And then we have thin outline. There's no bold outline here. And for space here, probably there is a vantage point. Sure, it'd be beyond this wall. I don't see atmospheric perspective. It doesn't have enough distance. So there's overlapping, excuse me, foreshortening, of course, on the wall and the bed, I would say. Yeah. And diminishing size and a vanishing point. In other words, scientific perspective. Okay. Now we have to go this way. I'm going to end with this one because we already did this, and I wish I could tell you about this, but we went in early, right? So I'm going to just give you two more must-knows. Let's cut one of them. So those of you who are paying attention, focused on this, will get the benefit of not wasting your time studying or even reading about this one slide. Let's cross off Delacroix, third from the bottom. Okay, everybody see that? Delacroix or as they say in the Midwest, de la Croix, the massacre at Chios. We just don't have time for that, and I don't think it's on this file anyway. Third from the bottom, massacre at Chios, 1824. Cross it out, but we're going to do the last two now and still end a little early. Okay, this is a really interesting image. Okay, and this one is a German artist, actually. Friedrich, his name is Friedrich, Friedrich. Friedrich. The title is Monastery Graveyard in the Snow. Monastery is Monastery. Monastery Graveyard in the Snow, 1819. So who was Friedrich? Friedrich was the most famous German romantic painter of all time. Nobody debates that. By far the most famous and successful. He was different than the other romantic painters, though, because he had an obsession. There are two ways he was different than almost all other romantic painters. One was that he was, some say he was a deist. Well, that's too specific. You could just say that he wasn't a traditional, he was a spiritualist. But that also makes it sound like he, gave lessons in how to get high naturally. That's not what I mean. I mean, he believed there was a living spirit. There we go. A living spirit in all things on earth. Now, that should sound familiar to some of you if you know about Native American religions, right, before the arrival of Europeans. And many parts of the world still believe that. Some people call that animism. Yeah, you could use that word if you want. It wouldn't be incorrect. But I don't think that captures the spirit of it. He was both a Christian. So in a way, he has a vague similarity to Blake, but he's like 50 years later. He's not copying anybody, following anyone, but he probably knew about Blake. The point is, just to summarize it, he believed that there was a soul or a spiritual presence in all objects, living and inanimate, throughout the world. And therefore, we should respect them all. So he was nominally a Christian. He was raised Christian, and he said he did believe in God and, the Bible. But he also believed that there was, New Age, you could say early New Age Christian, if you want to put it that way, with a spiritual bent. It shows in his paintings. He loved landscapes that were desolate and that showed the effects of human misbehavior or, human negligence or even, violence. That's what you're seeing here. This is right after the Napoleonic Wars. Germany was the most badly damaged country in Europe after, because he attacked the German kingdoms. Germany is not a country, of course, not that far back. So he would attack the different principalities. You could just say kingdoms within what's now Germany. Multiple times Napoleon would decimate them because they resisted him or could, whatever. His dictator's mind said, they're my enemy. So, and he would lay waste to the towns and cities in those sections of Germany. So this was an area outside, who knows what town or what city, where a monastery had been, and it was ruined during the Napoleonic Wars. That's what you're seeing. So he's showing the ruins and a group of both nuns and priests. I used to think it was either one or the other, but I've done some research. It's both. Nuns and priests are walking through the snow in the middle and the dead of winter after the wars are over, but with their churches totally destroyed, to pray because they still believe in some, higher power, right? Or in some meaning to life. So here's what he said this painting represents. A melon is a quote, so you can put quote marks on it. You don't have to, but he actually said of this painting himself, what he was trying to convey is, quote, a melancholy contemplation of death. How cheerful, right? A melancholy contemplation of death. But then he went on to say, but even amidst the death and the ruins, there's hope if you have faith. So that was his religious aspect. So you get both, impressions, if you look here, or both reactions from this painting, at least you're supposed to. And look how realistic the front part of it is. This section here doesn't even look diffused like most romantic paintings, but clearly the whole back half is. Everything on the horizon, the trees in the middle ground, the church, well, not the entrance to it, but the back part of the ruins there on the back, what would have the back wall, are diffused. So it is a romantic painting. And of course, I already gave you the emotional component. That's what I just stated about his quote about the meaning of it. And then, of course, it is imaginative. And is it dynamic? Well, It's imaginative, and there's some dynamic detail, but not much. It's more stable than most of his and other romantic paintings. Okay, we'll do the form analysis, and we have one more must know. This is balanced very carefully. Look at it, so well balanced with these two trees of almost, I mean, roughly, but very consciously so. And the church ruins are in the middle. These gravestones over here, right, and ruin, fallen branches, things roughly balance out the stone, the grave markers, and the worshippers on the other side. The obvious rhythm, it's powerful rhythm with the trees. See, they've been burned in war. Probably this whole area was set afire by Napoleon's soldiers, the whole forest, right? So you see a very barren looking landscape. And that, of course, uh, creates sharp similar texture in the foreground and soft and diffuse similar texture, and again, diffuse modeling in the background and middle ground. Whereas the modeling and the texture are sharp and realistic in the foreground, of course, all the way up to about this archway here. And is it, well, I already said it's stable, isn't it? Except for a little bit of the details, like the top of the ruined church roof and maybe one or two branches, but even there, the branches here are pretty, so maybe the upper branches are somewhat dynamic. Everything has thin outline around it. The largest mass, well, that's hard to say. I guess I would say it's the two burnt trees in the foreground and then the ruins of the back wall of the church. And then I guess it would be the entrance, the archway. And then we have color. It's almost all neutral, black on the burnt trees, and of course, cool colors on the ruins and in the distance, I meant. And then we have for space overlapping, diminishing size, of course. I see some foreshortening, but not really. It's not obvious. It's hard to tell there's foreshortening here. Maybe right there is some. So minimal foreshortening, but there's definitely overlapping, diminishing size, atmospheric perspective, of course, along the horizon, and there is a vanishing point. So there is scientific perspective. Okay, and I will say one other thing before we get to our very last slide, which will still allow us to end slightly early. This painting no longer exists. It was burned up during the bombing of Dresden. I bet very few of you know what that was, unless you read Kurt Vonnegut's novel, which won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. It has been made into a movie, plays. Books have been written about that book. He lived through it. That was the worst terror bombing. I'm not sorry, terror bomb. I meant fire bombing. Well, you could call it that if you were in the city of Dresden, Germany. We and the Brits bombed that city so mercilessly with fire bombs that it not only destroyed the center of the city, it killed tens of thousands, as many as Hiroshima, not both Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, but almost as many as either of those incidents. In 3 days of nonstop firebombing, we created a firestorm that just literally consumed everything in its path, including the museum that owned this painting. So there's only photos of it left. That's why the actual original work of art is long gone. So all we have is slides of it. I don't know if anybody's heard of that, the bombing of Dresden, February 1945. Now, why did we do that? We weren't anywhere near Dresden yet. We never got there. It became part of East Germany. I've been there, by the way. It's been rebuilt because the Russians, the Red Army, was advancing faster than we were, and we wanted to send them a message: keep back, Jack. Don't go past this line, which we had negotiated at the last conference with the Allies, right? That they agreed they'd take this section of Germany and we'd take the other section to create the two countries. Some of you know what I'm talking about, East and West Germany. And so it was a statement of political statement that several tens of thousands of people died to make. There was no military target there any more than there was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's a matter of your perspective. I'm not saying it was or wasn't justified. That's up to each person to decide. But it's a pretty intense moment, and you don't read about it the way you do about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There were just civilians trying to escape the Red Army, and some of them were headed towards the American lines to surrender, but they never made it. Okay, so let's do one last thing. This is one of my favorite works of art that you've never heard of, I'll bet. It's our last must know, and it is Villers, if you're from the Midwest. Villers is the artist's name. Girl at Her Easel. That is the title she gave it, meaning a teenager, a young student, art student, of course. Girl at Her Easel. 1802. Villiers was one of the few successful women artists in France, or just say in Europe, even at that time. I mentioned how rare they were, but she was, I think, certainly the only French woman painter to have her own school of painting. She had women from all over France come study art, not just painting, but sculpture and drawing with her. This is one of her students, undoubtedly one of her best students. She must have chosen her for that reason. Who look at this expression? Isn't that an amazingly intense focus stare of a student who wants to master a new skill? And she's being taught by another master who, of course, is already famous. But there's also a level of humor to it. This couple is laughing because they're looking through this soot covered window, which either the artist, Villiers herself, or this young student wiped away, probably with a rag. Why? Because they want light to come through on their easels while they're sketching A and B into the room. And guess what they're sketching? A nude, almost certainly male model. Could be female, but probably male. So this couple sees that from across the river. This is Paris, by the way. And they would notice that there was obviously a naked man in broad daylight standing up in full view. And so they are looking at the scene that this woman's looking at, but she doesn't care about that. She's not, distracted by the fact that, some other people outside the window think it's amusing. It's a brilliant little slice of life. The French call that vignette. You can just say it's a little moment in time captured brilliantly by this artist. This is neoclassic. She's dressed as a Roman. That's a Roman style outfit, which all French middle and upper class women were dressed like, because Napoleon and his wife did. So it's even the furniture is Roman style. And then the building here is neoclassic, the architecture across the river. So it's a neoclassic style painting, super sharp and realistic, and it evokes past styles of clothing, furniture, and architecture. And I already told you the artist was. So let's go and wrap it up. She's totally balanced in the middle of the picture. The window balances the furniture. It's balanced, left to right, top to bottom, in a rough, approximate way. Then the semantics already said super sharp and realistic on her clothing. You can see her dress, her face, the window. And then we have overlapping, foreshortening, diminishing size. And here there almost certainly is a scientific perspective, a vanishing point. She's the largest mass, as you would expect to be. And then I guess it would be, depends on if you count this as one mass, the window, maybe the second largest, then the chair, and then her easel. There's only thin outline around this. It is mostly stable because she's mostly upright, except for the very top of her, from about here up. But even her head and neck are upright. So her easel and part of her upper body are dynamic. Everything else is stable. That couple, the wall, the window, the building, the chair, mostly stable. Colors cool on her clothing, warm on almost everything else. On the wall, on her skin, on her hair, and of course the cloth on the chair. The building is Yellowstone, so it's mostly warm. And let's see, are we missing? Oh, rhythm. Of course, the rhythm is the repeated shapes on her face, in her clothing, and the framing of the window and the building across the river in the background. Okay, I think I've covered everything on this one. So it's her last must know. And everyone knows you should have crossed off Delacroix, Massacre at Chios. We're not going to cover that. And I'll reduce this list again by like 30 to 40% when we do the review on the night. I meant the week before the final. Anybody have any questions about your papers or your extra credit or anything else we talked about tonight? Anybody? I always stick around in case anyone does. So you have 2 weeks for your papers. So, if you haven't picked something, you should get busy. And maybe a couple, I think 2 more, 3 more, maybe people still haven't done their first paper. So hopefully if you are one of those, you'll get that done first. And then maybe the second paper also by the due date, which is the 27th. And then you won't have points off on that if you get it in by 2 weeks from tonight. Okay, anybody have any other questions at all about anything from tonight or think about the papers? Okay, you can all email me, of course, at any time if you have questions. All right, good night. Good night, you guys. Take care. All right. See you next week. Yeah. Good night, Louise. Yeah, there we go. That should be.